Everyone can turn on their cameras, please. And we do have Ben is joining here momentarily. And there's Emily. It's like Ben is working through a tech issue with his computer, but he is working on getting in the room. Well, happy spring, kind of, verge of spring, late winter, verge of spring. It's feeling very spring-like in Helena today. It's low 30s and amazing. Whitney got splashed by a slush puddle, so we're feeling the thaw coming a little bit. Good morning, I'm Hope Stockwell. I'm the Sexual Assault Response Network Coordinator for the Montana Department of Justice Office of Victim Services. This is the Sexual Assault Response Network Committee meeting for February 21st. Thank everyone for being here today, both our members and the public who are listening today. We have a couple of things going on for our focus today. One, we'll have Jamie Bray Tanner, who is one of our committee members, and Lacey Van Grinsven talking about the work of the Crime Lab first thing today, and then we'll switch into the conversation about how states are paying for sexual assault forensic exams around the country. As we think about how Montana's is structured and whether we might want to consider changes to that structure in the future. So good meeting things to talk about today. Just as a heads up, I just sent out our meeting bug for March 21st from 2 to 4 p.m. this morning. So thanks for your patience as we pin down that time with our presenter. We'll be joined by Sarah Wangerin, who is an instructor with MSU's College of Nursing at their Kalispell campus. She's also the training director for the HRSA grant team at MSU that's been working on expanding our SARN training opportunities in Montana. She'll be speaking with us on March 21st about her PhD research into other states' SARN programs as we think about structure and stability and sustainability. So stay tuned for that conversation in March. But good morning, everyone. And I just want to go around the horn here and have everyone just talk briefly about what you've been up to, any conversations you're having related to sexual assault response in your communities or your work since our last meeting. And if you have any fun things you've been doing since then that you want to share with the committee, feel free. Eldina, I don't know if you've been to a concert lately, but I am going to start with you since I've been looking forward to seeing what your musical interests have been most recently since December.
Good morning. I actually have not been to any concerts, and I don't have any on the agenda for the entire year yet. So I know I see your face, Celine. I'm a little behind. I haven't. My agency has been deep in the legislature, as I think most of us who work for the state have been. Whether it's the bills or our budgets. So that's really been the focus for the last few months. Fun thing is I thought that I could sign up for a language class and like not drive myself crazy. So I'm taking a language class in the evenings and I don't know if I like it.
Which language?
Salish.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm doing a Salish language class online. This is my second quarter and sometimes I dream about going back to school and maybe getting a PhD, and then I think, why? What am I doing? So anyway, that's what I've been doing.
Cool. Growing edges in a few ways, language and still needing to plan some concerts this year. Brenda.
Good morning, everyone. Brenda George, Children's Alliance of Montana. Sorry, Hope, I'm trying to think about what we've been doing with medical providers. I think we have a few new ones that are interested. So our communities have been reaching out to us about what support we can provide to them, which is, training and peer review support. We upped our subscriptions we have a national peer review for our medical providers that's provided through our regional child advocacy center. So we provide the subscriptions to that. So getting everybody kind of recommitted to having that available to them. And Aldina, I tried to learn Spanish and it was really hard. I thought it was going to be not so hard. And it was really complicated. And I'm like, I don't want homework. Why do I want homework? So anyway, I'm very proud of you.
Good deal. Brett, good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I've been working on a lot of legislative stuff too. In fact, I just had a hour-long meeting this morning before this one with the MCAA on our legislation that we're working on. And I was actually just thinking when you started this, I currently have sexual assault related cases in basically every stage that we discussed at our last meeting. Including one going to trial here in a month or two. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm dealing with these sorts of cases kind of from every front right now, as well as some proposed legislation that we're supporting and opposing that, some would help and some would definitely hurt our ability to successfully navigate these sorts of cases. So
Thanks for that update, Brett.
Yep.
Detective Gadarian.
Hi everyone. I haven't been up to too much other stuff, I guess, just working. I was impressed last weekend when I got called into work that we are getting more senior exam nurses, so I did not have to go to Helena. So that was really nice and a nice surprise. Other than that, I have vacation in a couple weeks, so I'm really just looking forward to that.
Good deal. Yep, I know the crew at your local facility has been working hard, so glad to see that expansion. Jamie?
Good morning. We are in the thick of kind of the court season. It seems January through March, there's a lot of trials going on. So we're making sure that cases are done and ready to go, continuing our outreach with agencies. And then tackling the backlog. We have Danielle Klemenko. She just got signed off and is currently actively working on DNA cases as of January. And we're bringing on 2 more gals, Amy Howell and Emily Tuck. They're going to be doing their interpretation portion. So getting signed off on that in about 2 weeks. So we're super excited to have some additional help. So just kind of plugging along. As far as a fun fact, I guess last weekend, my family and my husband, and I have 2 girls, a 12 and a 5-year-old. We went skiing. And it's kind of the first time we've all been on the runs together. So I got a lot of chairlift confessionals from my kids. I got a lot of tea about middle school, so that's great. And then my 5-year-old is asking me random questions like, what's my favorite planet, Earth or Saturn? So it was a lot of fun. It's exhausting to try to keep up with them on the ski runs because they are now out skiing me. So
Yeah, I'm always impressed with those shorties and their skills they just bomb by. And I'm like, wow, I don't think I was ever that capable.
yeah, my youngest Isla is not a fan of stopping. She just likes speed. So
Well, that sounds like a fun time. Let's see, Captain Honeycutt.
Good morning, everybody. Hope, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Oh, there it goes. Okay, sorry, my computer's running a little slow because we're actually unthawing in Lewistown. So between all the stuff with the legislature going on, plus all of our court cases and trials that seem to be stacked all the way through like July every week, I'm not sure we have time for fun here. But we did get a new CAC up and going. The county gave us a new building, so we've been working on trying to get that set up, which is kind of nice to help the kiddos, and a little more room for parents and kids to go around. So other than that, we've seen the sun and above 0 temperatures for the first time in a month. So this is kind of nice.
That's awesome. Good news on the new building. I think Lewis and Clark County's CAC just moved into their building too, which Whitney might mention when she gets around. Mark?
Hi, we are like everyone else watching the legislature for bills that affect telehealth, as well as on a national level, still waiting to see if virtual visits will be extended past March 31st. So that's kind of the big thing going on right now. And like Eldina, I'm trying to learn a different language, but I'm doing it with Duolingo and Danish, and it's not going so great. I think I'm too old.
I used Duolingo. We got to go to Italy after we got married for a little delayed honeymoon, and I used it. And I really only at the time learned enough to say I'm pregnant. So in case I needed help, I could say that. And I did end up needing it. I went to a pharmacy and I said I need some heartburn medication. So we got it across with my very coarse Italian. Emily, you're next.
Good morning. Things are a little melty here in Bozeman this morning, which is nice, but also I love all the snow. Also been knee deep in all of the things legislature and sexual assault. I got to travel for a clinical skills event in February and see my nephews, and so that was really amazing. But of course, I came home with the cold that's been going around, and it just won't go away. So that's life over here.
Yeah. Well, hope you feel 100% soon. Hi, Heather, your turn.
Well, I don't know what you guys are talking about. We haven't been paying attention to the legislature. Just kidding. Just kidding, everybody. Right at the moment, we are working on, because of some of our staff turnover, we're working on the contracts for telesane, because new contracts are being awarded, and those are going to be in our 24-hour facilities because of the staff turnover that we end up having in a lot of our rural communities. It just allows us to have that 24-hour option while we look to find new nurses to train, new staff to train.
Well, thanks, Heather. That'll be interesting as we get into more of the telehealth conversation to hear what your experience with that is. Yeah. Christina?
We're holding on. It seems to be that we're yeah, we're doing more universal stabilization than we've ever done before. We're also trying to move into a new campus, which has been fun, and we're redoing remodeling. We're done with the SAC offices and are now remodeling the CAC, so that we have all of that going on. And I just in my real life, I'm just trying to keep ahead of the snow with livestock and 20-30 something children who have just now this week disappeared. And I was going, wow, that was a long Christmas break, endless Christmas break. So
Well, good. I'm glad you could be together.
yes, it was great.
Makes you also grateful for the peaceful, restful times. Good morning, Ben. How are you?
Not too bad. I hope everyone's enjoying the day. So over in Eastern Montana, we are hopefully in their final steps for getting our SARN contracts all set up so we can start performing them at Holy Rosary. And then we have upcoming training in April. I think there's 5 that will be doing their hands-on clinical aspects of the SARN piece, with MSU coming out in April. I don't remember the dates offhand, but it's a 2-day class. Hopefully we'll get 5 more that are trained and certified so we can expand that along with the contract. So that's where we're at with getting our program set up. And for fun-wise, been trying to get out snowmobiling with my youngest kid, but I'm getting too old for backcountry, and it really works me out trying to keep up with him going up and down hills, and I get stuck way too much. And I'm actually on my way to South Dakota to go ice fishing with my oldest son. So That's why I'm not on camera. I'm just driving right now.
Well, drive safe. We appreciate you being here. Sounds like some good times with family there. Let's see, I'm going to turn here to the Helena office. We've got Celine and Whitney with us. Whitney, I'll start with you.
Hi, everybody. I'd say since we met last, I went on vacation. I went to Arizona for a week and just soaked up some sunshine and heat, and that was great, but I felt like my pocket full of sunshine that I brought back depleted really quick when it was really snowy and really cold here, so that's okay. It's nice weather today and yesterday. Regarding sexual assault, I mean, as a forensic nurse, you're kind of talking about it all the time, every day. I'm excited for this conversation about payment stuff. I have fielded a couple of frustrated phone calls, I think, from people in our community about the structure of payment. So I'm hopeful for this committee and learning about it and what we can do in the future. Like Hope had mentioned, the Lewis and Clark County Child Advocacy Center moved into a new building in Helena. They got an upgrade. So that's good. They don't have a scary elevator anymore. And I'm going to be teaching at that skills lab that Ben was talking about in Miles City. There's 2 days in Miles City and 2 days in Billings. I think it's April 13th, 14th, and then Billings is 15th and 16th. So I know Emily and I are making that trek out there to do those trainings and continuing to work with MSU on hosting an online course in Montana and then possibly some more skills labs, either the end of summer or fall is the last that I heard. So yeah, that'll be great.
Yeah, we're excited about that opportunity. Celine.
Good morning, everybody. Celine Kepke, Attorney General's office. Like so many of you, I feel like all I've looked at in the last 6+ weeks is legislation. Had to go over and testify a few times. I've helped draft a few bills. And I'm ready for transmittal to be here so that the flood stops coming in. As far as stuff related to our committee work, one of the bills and one of AG Knudson's priorities this session was to work on strengthening our child sexual assault bills, primarily in the internet and grooming kind of world. But as we all know, that kind of bleeds over into potentially stopping a hands-on offense. So that's been one of the priorities that I've been specifically involved in. As far as fun stuff, my little 4-year-old is trying to wrestle. And so it's been a lot of fun watching him learn new things and deal with his stage fright and going out in front of these big groups of people that are really intense. But he's doing really great and it's really fun to watch.
Yeah. Let's see, did I get everybody this morning? I think somebody holler if I missed you, but I think we got all the way around the horn here. On my end and here in Helena, we have been busy with the program, the SARN program, a few things going on since the last meeting. First and foremost, we got the new kits in stock and they have been started shipping out to facilities, and whew, we are very glad to have more inventory of sexual assault evidence kits. And I just want to thank everybody in communities who was involved with helping redistribute kits that we had that were at lower volume sites to higher volume sites so that we didn't have any gaps in kit availability. But we're super excited to have the new kits coming out. I'm not sure anybody's actually gotten to use them yet because we are finishing up and asking people to use the last of their old kits, the old version, before they start using the new ones so that we're maximizing our program efficiency and efficacy with the dollars and inventory that we had. So that's exciting that we've got that going on. We have been planning for a prosecutor training. Mr. Irigoyen, if you'd like to attend April 23rd through 25th in Helena, we are hosting a strengthening sexual assault prosecutions training here at the Attorney General's office in our downstairs training room. We're hoping to have about 50 city, county, and tribal prosecutors from around the state. We've got about 20 folks registered so far, so that's great news. We've had registration open about 2 weeks, and so there's been a lot of interest. And I did share that registration information with you. If you have not yet shared that with prosecutors that you know in your area or contacts you have, Again, it is limited to active prosecutors, but it can be city, county, tribal, state, federal, whomever might be interested. We have 2 national speakers coming. The training is structured around the framework of the U.S. Department of Justice's framework they put out last year for strengthening sexual assault and domestic violence prosecutions. The primary author, Farah Gold, is one of our speakers who will be coming to attend the training, as well as an assistant county attorney from Maricopa County in Arizona, Kathleen Long, who has been specializing in sex crimes for more than a decade. And so the 2 of them are teaming up to bring this really great training. We're pretty excited about having this here. This is the prosecutor training 2.0. We had the first one last April, so we're excited to bring it back this year and have that teamwork from those national speakers. The last thing I would share is that we've been going through the online kit track system, doing a reconciliation or audit, if you want to call it that, just to make sure that the statuses are being kept current on kits by the various entities, medical, law enforcement, and making sure that those kits do get to the crime lab. And so we're working through that process, and I've been doing a lot of outreach with law enforcement lately, touching base on kits and making sure they're up to date. So it's been good to make those connections more with law enforcement. I think the first year of my work has been focused a lot on the medical facilities and getting into the prosecutor side and the victim advocate side, with some interaction with law enforcement, but this kit track reconciliation is really getting me out there in new ways, talking with law enforcement about the SARN program and kit track, et cetera. So that's been good to make those new connections. Before we get going, anybody have any questions or comments before we start this morning with our presentation from the Crime Lab? Okay, well, Jamie and Lacey, do you want to take it away? We'll get started with your presentation. We will call for a break at about 10 o'clock this morning. Timing wise, obviously, if you need to step out, please do so. And I'll just give a little content warning for everyone who is watching. We will be talking about sexual assault in detail today throughout the morning. And just a reminder, please take care of yourself. If you need to step away for a minute to take a breath, or just take a minute to yourself to find some inner peace and centralization, please don't hesitate to do that. We certainly understand that and want everyone to be safe in these conversations. So with that, Jamie and Lacey, please take it away.
All right. Just give me a quick minute while it loads up. Quick. So we will kind of go off screen here once we get it started. I think so. Yeah. It's working.
Sad part is we even tried this out this morning to make sure it was going to work.
Yeah. Here we are.
You're doing great.
All right. So you can see?
You can see it. Okay. Hope.
Okay, perfect.
All right. Let me do this. I guess. Okay. So. Yeah, I'm trying to. Yeah, it's not working. Oh, hold on real quick. I hope something's kind of course, going on with my computer. So that one, let's see. That's the one we're on. Oh, that's the one we're on. We're going to close out of our presentation real quick and stop sharing and try to reload it real quick.
Sure. And it's always a little tricky navigating the Zoom and the screen share with a PowerPoint. And for the public members listening while we're working on that, just a reminder that we do have public comment scheduled if you are able to stay until about noon today. It might be earlier or a little later, depending on how our flow goes today, but we do have a public comment time scheduled at noon today. And that will be on any matter within the committee's jurisdiction. Jamie, just FYI, we're not hearing you. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Lacey and I are kind of working through it real quick. All right. See, oh, there we go. Here we go. There we go. Are you guys seeing the presentation or?
Seeing the presenter view.
Okay, let me swap real quick.
Mm-hmm.
Now, are you able to see it?
Yep, we sure are.
Perfect. So we'll stop the video, or we'll stop sharing our images once we get started, but thanks for working through it with us. My name's Jamie Bray Tanner. I'm the biology supervisor at the Montana State Crime Lab. I started at the Crime Lab actually as a work study in 2003. And then I worked my way kind of through the section. I was the CODIS technician, a serologist, a DNA analyst, and then last February, I took over as supervisor when Joe Pasternak left for the private sector. And so it's been an interesting journey for me taking over as supervisor, but I've enjoyed getting to learn about the process. So thank you very much for inviting us to give you guys a heads up about what happens once those collected kits get to the crime lab, and for allowing us to kind of nerd out on science this morning.
Yeah. And I'm Lacey Van Grinsven. I've been at the crime lab since 2006, so about 18 years, and I'm a serologist. So I'm one of the people that actually does the screening of the kits and processing of the kits, and helped Hope with the redoing of the sex kit. So yeah, that's about it for me.
All right. So Lacey's going to start the presentation, and then I'll take over at the DNA portion. I apologize. My voice is a little scratchy. But we have a time for questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have any, if you want to remember them, and we'll have a time and place for that at the end. So we'll cut the video right now and get started. Is it working?
I don't know. It's not moving.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So you guys have been learning about what's happened at all the other stages, from collection to the officers, and I'm sure you're going to learn about the court stuff. But today we're going to talk about what happens at the crime lab when we receive a kit into the laboratory. So technically we're the State of Montana Forensic Science Division, but everybody pretty much knows us as the crime lab. So I'll also just refer to us as the crime lab. But we are in the Department of Justice under the Attorney General's office, and we serve the entire state of Montana. That includes all 56 counties, the sheriff's offices, the attorneys, probation and parole, the coroners, all the police departments. We do some cases from the reservations, not all of them, and it depends on the case. We also take Office of the Public Defender requests and do cases for fish, wildlife, and parks as needed. We have 2 locations, one in Missoula and one in Billings. The Billings laboratory has limited services available there. They only have the medical examiner and chemical analysis at that location, whereas in Missoula, we have all of the other services that are available. And those services that we have are the medical examiners, and what they do is they're trying to determine cause and manner of death. They're identifying bodies and documenting how those deceased persons are received, if they have diseases, what the possible cause of death is. And our toxicology department analyzes biological samples, so blood and urine, in order to determine the presence of drugs, poisons, and other toxins. They work closely with the medical examiners to help determine cause of death in postmortem cases. They also analyze those samples for DUI cases, sexual assaults, and probation and parole cases. And they are also responsible for maintaining breath alcohol testing instruments throughout the state and making sure they're all calibrated and working properly. Our chemical analysis section is the section that is identifying actual drugs themselves from evidentiary items. They also do gunshot residue testing to determine if someone may be in a gunshot residue environment or handled or shot a gun. And they do clan labs as well. Our firearms and tool mark section is the section that analyzes weapons, ammunitions, and tool marks to see if they can place those items within match a tool mark to a specific item of evidence, or if they can match a bullet to a gun. That's their job. They also restore serial numbers, do fracture match comparison and distance determination with gunshot residue. Our latent prints section does the comparison of skin impressions, including fingerprints, palm prints, and footprints. And then our quality assurance is the ones that handle our audits and our accreditation, and they make sure that we're putting out quality work and essentially doing everything that we say we're going to do in our policies and procedures. And then our evidence section is the section that intakes all of the evidence, puts it into our LIMS system or our laboratory management information system. And they also do all of the moving of the evidence to the sections and then returning it as well. And Jamie and I are part of the biology section, and that's primarily what we're going to talk about today. And we are the section of the laboratory that is responsible for analyzing all the sex kits. Not only do we do that, but we analyze evidence from all crimes that has potential biological evidence for the purpose of identifying and individualizing biological materials found in that evidence. We have serology, Y screening, DNA, YSTRs, and we also participate in CODIS, which is the FBI's National DNA Database Program. This is our staff that we have currently. We have Jamie, who's our supervisor, who's here with me today. And then Megan Ashton is our technical leader and our CODIS administrator. We have 7 DNA analysts. Danielle, who's the one who just recently became the DNA analyst, and then 2 that are in training, Emily and Amy. And then we have 3 serologists and another CODIS analyst. So the types of cases that biology does is sexual assaults, homicides, assaults, body identifications, property crimes, cold cases, and then we also process all those convicted offender samples for work in the database. We currently have only the 13 lab personnel in our section, and it depends on the year, but we can receive anywhere between 500 and 800 cases a year. And that includes all of those case types right there. And not only do we have all those cases, but each case probably has a number of samples that we have to analyze. So for example, in 2024, there were 2,301 samples from those cases that we had to analyze. We also process more than 300 convicted offender samples per year. And what that means is that anybody in Montana who is convicted of a felony has to submit their reference standard so that we can analyze it, develop a DNA profile, and then put it into the convicted or to CODIS. And those are searched against evidence type samples. And Jamie's going to talk about that a little bit more later. So in 2024, there were approximately 331 kits that were submitted to the laboratory. And every kit that is submitted to the laboratory has to undergo testing here as per the law. Each one of those kits averaged about 3.47 samples. And so in 2024 alone, we had over 1,000 samples just from kits that we had to analyze. So our purpose here is to examine items of evidence, and we do it in 3 sections. And so what we're trying to do is determine if there's biological material there. And if there is biological material that is informative, we then try to determine the potential source of that biological material or DNA. And what is DNA? So DNA is basically the building blocks of life, and it's deoxyribonucleic acid. And I'm also going to let Jamie talk about that more later because that's more out of my wheelhouse. So, but what are some sources of DNA? So you get DNA in pretty much every cell of the body, but what we're looking for is nucleated DNA, and that's found in the nucleus of cells. And so some potential sources of that are body fluids, including blood, semen, saliva, vaginal secretion, sweat, and mucus. But you can also get that from sloughed skin cells or epithelial cells. And so we have screening tests available here for blood and semen, but we will also test other sources for potential DNA. We just don't have a way to identify what those potential sources are. And so there are other types of DNA that can be done as well, like mitochondrial DNA and YSTR DNA. And Jamie might talk about that a little bit more later as well. In our section, we are essentially 3 sections in one. So we do things in steps. And the first step is going to be the serology, which includes Y screening. And what we're doing there is we're screening all these items to determine, hey, like A, is there blood or semen there? And if there is, then that moves on to the second step, which is DNA. And they're trying to determine who that potential DNA belongs to. And they have a number of ways that they can do that. And then the third part of our process is the CODIS process. And that's where they try to determine if there may be any connections between cases or individuals. Before the evidence gets to us, though, it has to be, it comes into the laboratory and has to go through our evidence intake. And the evidence can come into the laboratory by either personally being sent, by being delivered, couriered, or mailed into the laboratory. And it has to be submitted with this evidence submission form that you see here on the side. And so the agencies fill that out. And then our evidence staff make sure that the evidence is received sealed and that it matches what the submission form says. Once they make sure that everything is submitted properly, they'll enter it into our LIMS system, which we call Justice Tracks. And that allows us to track all of our evidence through the laboratory, to write reports, and to keep track of everything. Once it's properly intaked into the laboratory and has a barcode, it's placed into the secure vault until we need the evidence. They make a request for whatever section needs to do the analysis, and then we get that request. Once that serology request is made, we look at the case to make sure that we have everything that we need and that the submission policy was followed. And that leads into kind of why the biology section has a submission policy and what we're doing with that. We would love to test every item of evidence that comes into the laboratory. However, for something like a homicide, you can have hundreds of pieces of evidence, and we just do not have the capability to analyze all those evidentiary items, not with our staffing and just our instrumentation and everything. So we have created a submission policy for the laboratory and specifically for our section. Now, submission policies are pretty common nationwide. Every lab has different testing capabilities and resources. And so if you look at other labs throughout the country, it's not uncommon to find a submission policy. Because we're also serving the entire state and we're the only serology and DNA section in the laboratory, we found that it would be beneficial for us. And we looked at the types of evidence items we had to determine how many samples it takes generally to answer the question at hand. And we took those questions and then put them into our submission policy as a general guideline as to what we can take. So for the submission policy, for homicides, what we typically do is ask the agencies to limit their initial analysis for 10 items. For sexual assaults, it's 3 items, typically, which is the kit and then a pair of underwear or condom. For property crimes, right now, we're accepting 2 items, and they have to have a potential body fluid source, so like blood or saliva. We're not doing touch DNA on property crimes as of right now. And then for other types of crimes, we have robbery, physical assaults, those types of cases, we're accepting 5 items at this time. Now, with all that to say is if we are not answering the questions at hand with those initial items, we'll contact the agency or they can contact us to submit additional items for us to do testing. So we're not just saying we're going to test these items and that's it. We try to work with the agencies always to answer the question at hand. We always ask for a reference standard because that allows us to compare the evidence samples if we develop a profile to that reference standard to potentially determine if it came from that person or if that person can be excluded. And then we always have to ask for a report to be submitted along with that evidence as well. And why do we ask for a report? We asked for the report for a number of different reasons. For the first reason that we asked for it in the serology phase is to determine to make sure that we're working the correct items of evidence and that we're doing the proper types of analysis on those items. So for example, if we had a sex kit, but we didn't know who the sex kit came from or who the potential assailant was, and they're both same sex, we Y screened it, and that's not the proper process to use for that, then we could potentially be wasting evidence or missing things as well. And then our DNA folks need that report to determine if profiles are eligible for the CODIS database. And Jamie will probably mention that more later too. So if anybody cares to look into this anymore, and I don't know if you will, but we do have the submission policy online on the DOJ webpage where our Forensic Science Division page is. We also have other evidence resources. It's where you can find the sex kit forms, evidence collection resources, and a lot of other information for the lab. So once the evidence has come into the laboratory and we have a kit, we generally perform what's called Y screening on that kit. And what we're doing in that process is we're looking for male DNA. And so it's essentially the first part of DNA analysis, where we're doing an extraction of all the DNA that's in the molecule or the cells in that sample. We're running it through some instruments to determine if male DNA is present. And then we determine where it goes from there. So this process is a lot faster than traditional serology. It's a lot more sensitive. So we're able to determine if male DNA is there versus serology. And it's also quick. So it's faster than traditional DNA extraction, but it's not as exact or accurate, I would say. This process is useful only when we have a female victim and a male assailant. If you have female, it's not going to really tell you anything. Or if you have a male kit, it's also not going to tell you much. And so for those types of kits, we have to do traditional serology techniques. We use an almost entirely automated system to do this process. So we have a robot and then another instrument that quantifies it. It's, like I said, it's faster and it can tell you if male DNA is present, but at this stage, we can't tell you whose DNA is present on the sample. It has to go on for further DNA testing if you want to determine potentially whose DNA is present. Another drawback kind of is that it has to be at a high enough concentration to be detected. So it is possible that some samples may have male DNA on them, but we're not able to detect it. I will say, though, that this is much more sensitive than a traditional serology technique. And so we're able to find male DNA on things that potentially only have, seminal fluid versus what we would be able to do with serology. So in the Y screening process, there's basically 4 steps, and I'll talk about them a little bit more in detail, but you take a cutting from it, you place it onto a robot, you evaluate it for the presence of male DNA, and then we have to go back and portion it and forward all those samples for DNA analysis. So when we're assessing a kit, we have to open each kit, determine what's inside of the kit, and then we're sampling every swab that's in the kit. And to do that, we take about 10% of each swab and place it into a column, which is then transferred to the robot. Now, what we do is, when I say we test every swab in the kit, is that we do test every swab, but swabs from a specific area can be combined. So, for example, if you have a vaginal sample and it has 4 swabs in there, each one of those swabs is tested, but it's tested together as that sample. But that sample would be separate from the oral swabs or the rectal swabs. We are able to, doing this process, batch multiple cases together. So it allows us to be a little bit more efficient with our testing and allows us to get more done at one time. So we may have multiple kits from different cases on a rack, but we only ever have one kit open at a time to help prevent contamination. We can do about 48 samples on one run or batch on the instrument. And this is the instrument that we use. It's called an Autolus, a Hamilton Autolus liquid handling robot. And up at the top, you can see those orange topped tubes. Those would be each one of the columns that we transfer the swab cuttings into. So each one of those would be a sample from a sex kit. This robot does the extraction, and then it sets it up onto a plate that we can use to then transfer to a different instrument to quantify how much male DNA is there. Now, once you're done extracting the DNA from this, we can't use it any further, so that extraction is then discarded. And this is kind of a little schematic on how we do the extraction. What we do is we take that small cutting, we place it into that column, we add chemicals to that, heat, and we shake it. And then we're able to separate it out and collect that liquid in the bottom. And that liquid then contains all that DNA. And that's what we're determining if there's any male DNA there. But we call it generally like a lysate or an extract. So once we have that extract, we'll set it up onto a plate, and then we'll quantify how much male DNA is present. And you can kind of see on the right-hand side there, the worksheet that we use. It tells you the sample name, how much total DNA is there, how much male DNA is there, and then it flags it for us as to whether or not there's male DNA and if we should collect it and send it forward for DNA analysis. And this is kind of a schematic of what happens after quantification. So if there is male DNA present in the sample, that sample is then collected and forwarded straight for DNA analysis, where they'll determine if male DNA is there or no male DNA and kind of do their processing. If there's no male DNA in the kit or the sample, we'll look to other items in the kit. So we might do clothing, we might do underwear, we might try and swab a condom if we need to, and look for male DNA on those items. This can become kind of circular, where we're going back to a lot of other items to determine if there are any samples that have biological material that will be useful for DNA. If there is semen or DNA is present, or we've exhausted all the items for serology, then we'll write a report. That report has to be reviewed, and then it's submitted to the agencies. We have multiple reports that go out of the laboratory. And I think that's where a lot of agencies get confused, is because we have a serology report, which just has the screening results on it, or the Y screening results. And then later there's a DNA report. And so in multiple steps that we have, we do reports, and then they all have to be reviewed before they go out. And so the results come in steps, I'd say. If there is no male DNA, it moves on to what we call the traditional serology, or if the kit can't be screened for male DNA. This uses traditional techniques to identify body fluids. And like I said a little bit earlier, in Montana, the only tests that we have available to us to use is for indications of blood and for semen or seminal fluid. There are other laboratories that do testing for like saliva or urine, but we have not become proficient in those. We found that they kind of just use unnecessary sample. They may not be very specific or very sensitive. And in lieu of using up that sample, we just decided to forward those types of samples directly to DEEPs. Serology helps us to identify the biological fluids, and we use multiple different techniques. So we have visual techniques where if you see a stain that looks like it could be blood, we test it. Alternatively, if like you can't see a semen stain very well, we'll use an alternate light source, and that semen has a specific wavelength under which it fluoresces. And so the light source that we use allows us to determine if there are any fluorescent stains that are present. We also have available to us now an infrared light and camera to help us determine if blood is present on dark colored items, because it can be difficult to see with the naked eye. Once we've identified the stains of interest, we'll do what's called a presumptive test. And now a presumptive test tells you if a substance can be present. So for example, for blood testing, we use a test called Kastle-Meyer, and it's very sensitive. It can detect blood into like 1 part in 10,000 at least. but it's also not very specific. So there are things that can be false positives. So if you get a report from us, most of the time it will say that there were indications of blood that were detected, and that's because we're not using a confirmatory test. A confirmatory test would be something like microscopy on semen stains. And so if you see a sperm cell, that would be considered a confirmatory test because there's only one source of sperm cells, and that would be from semen or seminal fluid. That's not found in other bodily fluids. So we can say at that point that we've confirmed that semen was present. This is just kind of a visual of the lights that we use for our alternate light sources for looking for semen or seminal fluid. And we use a light source that's between 415 and 460 nanometers. And that allows us to determine if semen is present. Unfortunately, there are other body fluids that also fluoresce. And so once we've identified fluorescent stains on an item, we have to circle them and then do that presumptive testing. This is just a kind of a fun example of what it might look like under a fluorescent light, a semen stain or a different type of stain. And then this is what our IR or our infrared camera looks like when you can see on the left side how there's a visual red-brown staining on the red part, which is easily seen. But on that black side, you can't really see any staining. But when you subject that to the infrared light and camera, you can see that there's additional staining on the black side, which we've gotten this recently and have found it to be really useful for working dark items of clothing so that we're not missing anything. One problem with that, though, is that you have to have a contrast with the absorption and reflection. And so some materials don't work well with using this method. This is just kind of a schematic of what the types of tests that we're doing for our presumptive testing. So for blood, the tests that we use are phenolphthalein, which is also called that Kastle-Meyer test, and hemotrace. And Kastle-Meyer is basically an oxidative reaction that occurs when hemoglobin is present in an item. So we use chemicals, and we don't apply the chemicals directly to the item. So if we have a swab, we'll wet a swab, or sorry, we'll wet the filter paper, rub it to the swab to try and transfer some material to it, and then we'll apply our chemicals to that filter paper. And when we do that and there's hemoglobin that's present, it changes colors. So to that bright, like purple color that you see there. The acid phosphatase is a similar type of test where it's also a color change test or an oxidative reaction like that. And so when those presumptive tests are positive, then we'll forward the stain for further testing if it's necessary. We also have a test called hemotrace, which tests for indications of human blood. We don't use that all the time on our cases, though, only if there's a question as to whether or not it could be from a different type of source. For example, if we do a lot of outside testing or like vehicle testing, then we'll do that hemotrace test. For semen identification, we also have that microscopy test that we do. And so we take a small cutting of the swabs, and then we stain the slide and physically look for sperm cells. You can kind of see some of them on the side towards the right there. For saliva, if you need to do saliva testing, you'll have to outsource that to a private laboratory. This is, we don't do that here. I guess I should have, sorry. This is just a better graphic of that Kastle-Meyer test that we use in the positive and the negative, and then the acid phosphatase as well. And so you can kind of see the difference between a positive and a negative reaction.
One of the common questions we do get is, can you tell the difference between menstrual blood and regular blood? And currently there at this laboratory and really among the forensic community, there is no validated test to distinguish between menstrual blood or any blood if you've cut your finger. There are some RNA tests that are going on and being developed through some private laboratories and private commercial firms, but within the public sector of public crime labs, there really isn't a way to distinguish or test to distinguish the difference between menstrual blood or regular blood.
Yeah, and that's kind of the same issue that we run into with vaginal fluid. So there are times where it would be very useful to test for vaginal fluid, for example, on suspect's bedding, because finding semen on a suspect's bed doesn't really inform you of much because you can't tell when it was deposited, and it's not a crime to have semen in your own bed. But if you could put vaginal fluid on that bedding, then it would be useful. But there are not really any tests that are commercially available for that type of testing. This is just a nice, pretty picture of what what sperm cells look like when we actually can find them. So in order to find them, we use what's called a Christmas tree staining, and it's called that because it stains the head of the sperm cell of this bright, pretty color that's red, and then the tails are a green color. A lot of times you don't see the tails because they're very fragile and they're easily lost over time. There's a couple in that first picture though, and then there's only one sperm on that right-hand side. So that's more typical of what we see when we're doing a sperm search. So this is the confirmatory test. What it is, it's an immunological test, and we have one for both semen and for seminal fluid. So the one, or excuse me, for blood. The one that we use for blood is that hemotrace test, and it's an antibody for human hemoglobin. Unfortunately, ferret blood and also higher primates can test positive. So it's very indicative of human, but it may not always be human blood. However, having a ferret or a monkey on your crime scene is not generally likely. And so if we do get a positive test with that, it's more likely that it's human blood than something else. And the reason that we have the test for semen is because a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, but there are times in which a human may not have semen or sperm cells in their semen. And cases of that may be like a medical condition or vasectomies, which are quite frequently, or which are quite common now. And so the test that we use for that is testing for prostate-specific antigen, which is in really high concentrations in the seminal fluid. And so you can have false positives with that. So that's why we have confirmatory in quotes there, is because they're another test that leads us and gives us further support that it is a body fluid in question, but there can also be false positives for that. In our laboratory, we no longer do trace analysis, and there are not many laboratories that do trace analysis any longer. And to my knowledge, there aren't any laboratories that do actual hair comparisons. That would be taking a bunch of hairs and saying that they're similar to hairs from a crime scene. We are, however, able to do evaluation of hairs for DNA suitability. And so we can look at a hair and tell you if it has a root, and if so, if that hair is similar to a human hair or not similar to a human hair. So we can collect hair roots for cases where it's important and forward those for DNA analysis, but it's not something that we do often, I would say.
Yeah, it's pretty rare.
It would generally have to be where there's absolutely nothing else in a case and the hair is the only thing that's left. So just another graphic of kind of the process that we use in serology for a sex assault. Typically what we would do is the Y screening on the kit, and then if male DNA is there, it goes directly to DNA analysis where they perform their analysis. If there is no male DNA, then it moves on to serology. If there are samples that are collected there, then those go to DNA analysis. Either way, along the steps of the process, there are always reports that are being done. We have to make sure that we're following our policies and procedures because we are held to very high standards with the FBI and also our accrediting bodies. And so we have to do reviews of all of our work before it goes out the door. And then that generally is used for court purposes, in which we're out of the lab testifying quite a bit as well, especially this time of year. And now Jamie is going to talk to you about this part of the process.
So what is DNA? Like Lacey said, DNA is the deoxyribonucleic acid. That is not a fun name to remember or spell on when I'm on the stand. It's DNA is approximately 99% similar between people. However, there is approximately 1% that makes us unique between individuals, except identical twins. We look at regions in that 1% that differ to utilize DNA for identification. And then different sources of DNA from one person will produce the same profile. So if I swabbed my arm and I swabbed the inside of my mouth, the DNA profile that is generated from both of those regions would be the same. So DNA processing steps, Lacey touched on it just a little bit. How does it work? What happens once serology or Y screening has been performed? Where does it go from here? Well, a DNA analyst will get the case file and assign it to themselves. They research the case file. They'll look through the police report. They'll look for the SARN forms, and then they'll create a batch. A DNA analyst can work multiple samples from multiple cases at a time, where we call it a DNA batch. We separate it through controls. One sample is opened at a time, but we can work a vaginal swab and they go into individual tubes and precautions are made, but DNA analysts research the case or create a batch and then proceed forward with performing DNA analysis. So forensic DNA has come a long way. Since probably the biggest DNA case that everyone is familiar with is the O.J. Simpson. What used to be where you would need quite a bit of DNA to generate a DNA profile with the commercial kits and the sensitivity these days, even in the 30 plus years since, the early 90s, we only need about a pinhead to obtain a DNA profile, a pinhead of blood. Commercial kits have gone from only having a couple locations to now what we're calling these larger megaplex kits, which targets 22 locations in the sex chromosome. So the regions of DNA used for identification are called short tandem repeats, or if you call a DNA analyst, sometimes they'll go into the abbreviations, which are referred to as STRs. Like I said earlier, the current technology we use targets 22 locations on the chromosomes, and we are able to determine the sex marker, which is called amylogenin, which lets an analyst know if there's male or female or a mixture. And so all of these data from these different locations on the chromosome are used to create a DNA profile. So the steps in generating a DNA profile include extraction, quantification, amplification, separation, and then data analysis. So the first step is DNA extraction. We have two different types of DNA extraction. We have a cellular extraction and a differential extraction. They're both similar in the sense of adding chemicals to the sample. So a swab is placed into a tube, swab from a vaginal swab or swab from a can. Chemicals are added, heat, agitation. The chemicals are breaking open those cells. The heat is helping aid breaking open those cells and releasing the DNA from the nucleus. And then there's a series of steps and washes that help isolate the DNA. The difference between a cellular extraction and a differential extraction is that in the presence of male DNA or semen or seminal fluid, in a differential extraction, we're able to separate sperm cells from non-sperm cells. So from one sample, I've received a vaginal swab from the serologist. By the end of the differential extraction, I'll actually have two samples. A fraction, or the sperm cell containing fraction, and the second fraction is the B fraction, or the non-sperm cell containing fraction, or the epithelial cells. So the remainder of the cellular material from a vaginal swab. And those two samples are then forwarded on through the DNA process. So once extraction occurs, where we've removed the DNA from the item, we need to find out how much DNA we have. And like Lacey had said, it goes to a process called quantification. And this gives us an estimation of how much DNA we need or how much DNA may be present in that sample. Through a series of validations, and based on our amplification kit, we have a targeted amount of DNA that we need in order to move that sample forward for traditional DNA analysis, or those STRs I talked about. So at the quantification step, I'm trying to determine if I have some sufficient amount of DNA to move forward. If I don't, then I'm either going to stop my analysis and not move that sample forward, so I'm not using unnecessary amounts of evidence, or I'm going to look at the case details and see if maybe there's some other testing or other steps that might be needed to move that sample forward. So if I have enough DNA present, I'm going to move it to the third step, which is amplification. And we use the polymerase chain reaction, or what's commonly known as PCR. And it makes many copies of the targeted DNA regions, or in court, we'll describe it as DNA xeroxing. So millions of copies can result from only a few pieces of DNA. Amplification has also come a long way with these commercial amplification kits. From even when I started, they've gotten very sensitive, and they're helpful for old, degraded, or samples with minimal DNA present. After we have amplified our DNA, we'll take that amplified DNA and place it on an instrument called a genetic analyzer, which is what is in the corner right there. That is our 3500. It's taking the copied DNA fragments and are separating them by size and length. So we look at the 22 locations, or 23 if you include the sex marker, and the information at those locations generates the profile. And the loci, or the locations that we look at, are listed right next to that genetic analyzer. So just kind of a quick short tandem repeat. What we're looking at is this is a pair of chromosomes, where it's pointing at, that's a specific location on the chromosome, a locus. Multiple locations are loci, and that's the allele. That's the genetic information right there. And that is the variation in the number of repeats. So those same repeats are at that location. So at that specific one, that is a 6. On the other side of that pair, there's 4 of that specific repeat. And so the genetic analyzer and the software would give that location a 4 and a 6 for the number of repeats. This is what a simple DNA profile looks like. So these are our 23 locations. This would be considered a single source. So DNA, you get half of your DNA from your mom, half of your DNA from your dad, resulting in a pair. So at one of the locations, there's a 15 and 18. The mom might have had the 15, the dad, the 18. Now at another location, you have just a single one, a homozygote, which means both parents had a 14 at that location and passed that on to their child. Known DNA reference standards, when we call an agency and say, hey, do you have a reference standard from this individual? This is what the profile looks like. We're using this for comparison purposes. In some instances, some evidentiary samples do generate a simple DNA profile, but in more instances, this is what we get, which is what's defined as a mixture, where 2 or more people are contributing their genetic information to this evidentiary item. In this particular profile, I believe it was this was a mixture of at least 2 individuals. When an analyst obtains a DNA profile from an evidentiary item, they will perform the analysis on it. And then once the analysis is complete, the genetic analysis, then they'll do the comparisons to the known DNA reference standards, if available. But on vaginal swabs, a swab of a can, it's not unheard of to have a mixture. And then it's up to the DNA analyst to interpret that mixture. And one of the ways to do interpretation is what we used to do. Last year, we validated a new method. It's been several years in the making, called SARMix, which is a computer software program that analyzes the genetic profile. In the old days, we did what's called binary statistics. And so a DNA analyst would calculate a major or a minor, or who's contributing the most DNA to that, or they would perform a deduction. Especially deduction was used on intimate items such as a vaginal swab, where they could subtract out the known contributor. So whoever donated, or whoever's vaginal swab it was, you could take their known reference standard, subtract out, and what was left over was the second contributor. Now we've moved away from that and have moved over to StarMix, which is doing probabilistic genotyping. With StarMix, we're able to use the entirety of the profile. It's using all of the genetic information and being able to provide more results that way. And it's a set of algorithms. It's complex math, but it's providing more and more results on what was once deemed complex, because through the series of calculations in the old method, we weren't able to use some of the data if it fell below or dropped out. Well, the software is now accounting for that. So what was once deemed complex is no longer, and we're able to use those results. And I'm not going to get into too much of it, but just to kind of give everyone a heads up that that's where our section has moved towards interpretation. In the old days, we would report out kind of a lengthy paragraph of a DNA profile was obtained from this item. It's a mixture, and it read kind of, like a story. We've moved to a chart format. So I think it's a little bit easier to read, and it incorporates the results from the probabilistic genotyping that's done. So I'm not going to get into kind of the nitty-gritty. If you do receive a DNA report from us, I highly recommend contacting the analyst, but it'll list out the item number, the number of contributors, the different propositions, H1, H2. It provides the statistical weight if there's an inclusion or exclusion. And we're moving towards likelihood ratios away from the random match probability. I'm not going to go into the stats of that. It provides the verbal summary, and then if it's CODIS eligible. So if you do get a DNA report from us starting from June 2024 and on, I highly recommend contacting the analyst, working through it, because it is a little bit different than what we have done in the past. And this is the way that crime labs are moving throughout the US. I think there's around 80 crime labs now using StarMix. It's becoming the norm of probabilistic genotyping. So what does all of this mean? You get a DNA report. I highly recommend reading the DNA report, contacting the analyst for any questions, or if more evidence needs to be worked, but also paying attention, because within those results, there's also some CODIS information as well. Was a profile uploadable to CODIS, or samples may need to go on for YSTRs. So the crime lab started doing YSTRs, I believe it was 2022. And this year, as moving into the supervisor role, one of the goals was to do outreach. And what we found was some of the agencies didn't even know we needed, or we were performing YSTRs. So on a DNA report, there's various statements that are made. Additional results will be provided in a future forensic report. That sample is going to move forward to WISE. Please contact the lab should this request be needed for YSTRs. you're going to get a phone call from us or call us, or we may have already gotten STR or short tandem repeat results. Or if we need a reference standards for WISE, that'll be in that report. But more importantly, what are YSTRs? It's useful for small amounts of male DNA. It's actually pretty sensitive. And what I like to describe for YSTRs in court is that, say you have a choir of all females and you have one male in the front singing. In traditional STRs, all you would hear are the females. With YSTRs, they're going to pinpoint that male singer, so only his voice can be heard. So that's what YSTR analysis does. It targets only areas on the Y chromosome, and it's only usable for male DNA. The difference between STRs and YSTRs is that all males in a family have the same YSTR profile. So my husband's YSTR profile is the same as his dad, and it's the same as his brother. And so there's really no distinguishing characteristics as far as like STRs, but it can provide an informative result. YSTR profiles are not eligible for CODIS entry, and we have to have a reference standard for comparison. In traditional STRs, you'll get ginormous stats like 1 in 890 octillion. You're going to have a smaller likelihood stat with YSTRs because of all the sharing along the paternal line. So again, the pros of using YSTRs, it targets areas on that Y chromosome with males only. You can target small amounts of male DNA and large amounts of female DNA. The limitations, again, not as distinguishing as traditional STRs, that paternal, it can't go up to CODIS, and we have to have a reference standard because there is no database to compare against. We need something to perform that comparison and the statistic. If we do get informative STR results from evidentiary samples in that case, that sample won't always go on for YSTR. Again, it's a good investigative lead or investigative information, but due to the more distinguishing STR analysis, we usually stop at that if there are some of those results available. And this is just kind of an idea of what a YSTR report would look like. So we have the items that were analyzed. It references a previous report that STRs were attempted. And then it goes through the individualized report or results for each of the items that were tested. It provides the statistical database and also the results for that likelihood ratio stat. So CODIS, if you get an evidentiary profile from DNA profile from an item of evidence, it may or may not be eligible to be uploaded to the national database. CODIS is the Combined DNA Index System that's operated by the FBI. Megan Ashton is our CODIS administrator and is also serving as our technical leader right now. So what is CODIS? It allows us to search unknown suspect samples from evidence items against convicted offenders, arrestees, and other forensic samples at the state and national levels. The FBI has set forward very specific rules and criteria for a DNA profile to be eligible, such as we have to have enough genetic information. It has to originate from a crime scene. And there's some other ones that I can get into, but that police report helps us determine if a profile is eligible to be uploaded. Some states are taking arrestee profiles. Montana does not, but we are a convicted offender only or all felon state. So DNA profiles from solved and unsolved cases can be entered into the database. Profiles developed from evidence and convicted samples are compared among all 50 states and Puerto Rico. If a match occurs between an unsolved case and a convicted offender sample, whether it's been solved or unsolved, we issue a hit confirmation report and law enforcement is notified. And then CODIS provides an investigative lead only we have to have a reference standard to confirm, and I'll go into that in just a little bit. So one of the common things or phone calls I get is, hey, that I have a person of interest, that person of interest DNA is on file. Or my suspect or my person of interest is already in CODIS. We cannot use CODIS profiles for comparisons with FBI samples. It's just per their rules. There's not a chain of custody kept on those CODIS samples. It's a whole separate area of the laboratory. And we cannot calculate a statistic to a CODIS hit. When a CODIS hit is issued, we have to confirm that hit. And that is where the letter is sent to the law enforcement agency requesting that a new reference standard is provided so we can do the comparisons and then provide the statistic. And then elimination reference standards are just as important. What Lacey pointed out on the SARN kit forms is there's an area for a consensual sex partner. We don't want to upload samples that shouldn't be to CODIS. And so if a consensual sex partner has been identified, we'll a lot of times ask for that so we can do the comparison to the profile so we're not uploading someone who shouldn't be in the database. So what is allowed at the or what is allowed into CODIS? DNA profiles from probative evidence samples. Evidence must have a connection to a crime or crime scene. That's where that police report comes in. One of the common things is a robbery. Say a casino was robbed, the person fled, and they ran down an alleyway. Or an eyewitness said, oh, they ran down this way. And a beanie hat is identified in the alley. Well, it's a common alleyway that numerous people were walking down. That profile that's obtained from the beanie might not be allowed up to CODIS. However, if the police report said, no, you know, this person ran out of the casino, I saw them wearing a beanie hat, that provides a little bit more of a connection to the crime. Or, you know, I found a cigarette butt, you know, a couple blocks away, that might not be eligible. But if someone broke into someone's house and there's blood at the point of entry, that type of information helps us determine if something is eligible for upload or not. DNA profiles from unidentified human remains. We recently validated a bone protocol, a mill grinding similar to what was used and has been used for the 9/11 victims, where liquid nitrogen is used, the bone is ground down and extracts are run. It's very sensitive. We've had really great success with identifying some unidentified human remains that are found in Montana. Or if we haven't anything to compare them to, once those samples are run, they can also be uploaded to CODIS. The DNA profiles from missing persons are also eligible. So what's not allowed? Profiles from an individual developed from their belongings. So a suspect shirt, anything collected from a suspect shirt is not uploadable. DNA profiles that match that elimination standard. So like a consensual sex partner standard. DNA individuals that are not related to a crime, or profiles from victims. So here's the CODIS hierarchy. The overall reaching CODIS lab is NDIS, the National DNA Index System, and that is run by the FBI. Each state has a state database. And then in some of the larger states, they do have local databases. So in Florida, there's Broward County or Miami-Dade. In Montana, it's just at the state level. There are no local labs. So at the state DNA level, if a profile is obtained from an evidentiary sample and uploaded to CODIS, it is first searched at the state database, where Montana convicted offenders can be searched against the Montana crime scene samples. Montana's crime scene samples are then searched against the Montana casework suspects. There is a suspect database at the state level. And then the crime scene samples are searched against one another to see if there's any trends or if cases can be linked through biological evidence. So at the national level, Montana convicted offenders are uploaded and searched among all of the 50 states and Puerto Rico. Montana crime scene samples are then also searched at the national database against other samples, crime scene samples, again, looking for, the same biological material if there's trends or multiple cases that are related. But Montana casework suspects are not uploadable to NDIS. So at NDIS searching, so say convicted offenders from Idaho can be searched against Montana's crime scene samples. Idaho crime scene samples can then be searched against Montana offenders. And then Idaho crime scene samples are searched with against Montana crime scene samples. So if a hit occurs, a law enforcement agency will receive a confirmation notice indicating that something was a hit occurred and who to contact, and that a new reference standard is needed. Once that reference standard is sent to the crime lab, the DNA analyst will run that and compare it against the original DNA results, perform statistics, and issue a new report. So that's kind of DNA in a nutshell. But there have been some challenges and complications of our section.
And so we have seen some challenges and complications with the sex kits themselves. And for starter, as Jamie was mentioning earlier, consensual partners can complicate things for downstream DNA analysis. And so in the sex kit forms, we have a specific question on the forms asking about previous partners within the week. This alerts us to know if we need to request a reference standard, and it should also alert the nurses as to how to collect the samples, because sample collection may be slightly different if they have a consensual partner versus if they don't have a consensual partner. So that can complicate things there. Another thing that can complicate things for us is like the gender identity and the biological sex. Because they may not always match, we need to know the sex assigned at birth, because it allows us to determine which processing we need to do with the sex assault kit. Because in Y screening, again, we're targeting that Y chromosome in order to determine if male DNA is present. And if somebody identifies as male, but they don't have that Y chromosome, then we can run into issues and we may end up missing samples that could potentially be informative and not collect them. Another thing that we've run into sort of recently has been excessive sample collection. So we have some samples that have one sample in them that's collected, and sometimes we have kits that have 10 samples in them. And so when we have those kits with 10 samples, that means that we are able to get fewer cases onto a batch run. And so overall, it's taking us much longer to get the cases out the door because we're having to work an excessive number of samples from one case versus being able to work multiple cases. Sometimes we run into poor sample collection where if a sample had been collected slightly differently, we may have been able to develop a DNA profile, or something wasn't collected that could have been collected, and sometimes there could be contamination as well. Kits can be used for not their intended purposes. Like we've seen kits that have been collected for assault type cases or strangulation type cases that don't have a sexual component. However, because of the way that the law is written, any kit that is collected and is sent to us, we still have to analyze it. So that can kind of slow things down and cause the gears to grind a little bit. So just overall general challenges, and through the outreach this past year, we've been talking a little bit about contamination. The kits we use for DNA analysis are extremely sensitive. And by adding on STAR mix, that probabilistic genotyping that's able to use all of the DNA, we're detecting more contamination sometimes. And so what we're recommending and what we do here at the lab
is changing our gloves frequently, not talking over evidence, wearing a mask, bleaching areas, taking those precautions so that if we get an unknown profile, if we have to call the law enforcement to get one of those elimination standards or an elimination standard from one of the SARN nurses, just to provide that information of who that DNA may belong to. We're talking to law enforcement and individuals just to remember about, DNA can be easily spread, and to kind of step back and think, okay, yeah, I need to change my gloves, or I shouldn't be talking over those swabs. I have a cold, or I'm not going to go out into the lab and work evidence. But when I do go out to the lab, I have my lab coat on, I'm wearing a mask and bleaching my areas, but just something to keep in the back of your mind. So backlogs and turnaround times. The DNA section has gone through a lot in the past year. We have lost, 3-4 people, at least 3, for a variety of reasons. But really, the biology section is the only section in this lab that is really 3 sections in one: serology, DNA, CODIS, and then each has its own subspecialties. So there's a lot of moving parts as a piece of evidence goes through, and a lot of different decision trees that take place where a lot of people are involved. Each case can have a numerous amount of samples that need to be analyzed. We're happy to analyze samples. When a nurse is listening to an individual, they're collecting and submitting those evidence samples to us and the kits. We're getting evidence samples from various other crimes, homicides, robberies, property crimes. All of those need to be analyzed, and all of those go through those steps, and all of those go through the decision tree. So one sample or one case can take months based on the type of samples, how many samples. Like Lacey had said, kits can have 12 samples. A differential extraction usually takes all day, and I can only do about 12 samples on a differential extraction. And so, the extraction portion can be time consuming. The screening, a blanket, when you screen a blanket, it could have hundreds of stains that need to be tested. And same with clothing items. The analysis isn't like it is on TV. It takes time. Supplemental reports and additional evidence and analysis are common. A lot of times, we'll work the evidence, and a couple months later, we'll hear back from either the submitting agencies or attorneys saying, hey, could I have something run? I need some additional evidence, and we're doing our best to accommodate them. So one case sometimes is never closed out. It could have multiple reports to that where we're working it over months. I think I've worked a case that has gone on one time for 6 years, where I was doing multiple analysis. I had multiple reports before it ever did go to trial. There's constantly the need to push cases forward, whether it's for court or public safety, the CSI effect and juries. They might not have submitted the DNA evidence on time. We're always happy to work public safety cases. We've worked a couple in the past year, where with a public safety case, it's all hands on deck. And so, a serologist, a DNA analyst, the reviewers are only focusing on that one case to get that case out in a very timely manner. So reviews are also kind of a time crunch for us. My serology has to have their work technically and administratively reviewed. DNA has to do that, where a qualified scientist has to technically review, and another scientist has to do an administrative review before that report gets out to the submitting agency or the attorneys involved. When I do a technical review, I'm looking at the report, or I'm looking at the data, I'm looking at the work and the report and make sure I agree with those results and it falls within our standard operating procedures as well as the quality assurance standards set forth by the FBI that we're required to follow. So like I said, the additional requirements specific to DNA are outlined by the FBI quality assurance standards as well as CODIS. So that's with the standards, proficiencies, and audits. Analysts have to have specific training and education requirements and background checks for CODIS users. For DNA, for you to become a DNA analyst, you have to have a degree in one of the hard sciences and you have to have required coursework. We're going through a lot of validations and extra projects right now. We've, in the last year, we validated 2 extraction robots, a bone extraction kit. We brought StarMix online. So we're constantly looking for improvements in both turnaround times in the section as well as technology. Along with newer technologies, there's problems with instrumentations that come up with the robots and as well as the amplification kits. Lacey touched on the testimony. Sometimes it requires multiple analysts out of the lab at the time, sometimes for days, which takes us away from current casework. And then our outreach and training, we've been kind of upping more and reaching out. I'm a firm believer in good communication between agencies and the lab so that everyone knows what our capabilities are. But that does take time out of the lab. One of the biggest things that the DNA section has gone through is staff retention. Like I said earlier, we've had 3 people in training over the past year. Joe Pasternak was the technical leader and the supervisor. He left for a private lab or a private company that specializes in forensics. We had another analyst, Andrew Ziegler, that went to another lab in Ohio. We had a DNA analyst that decided to go back to New Mexico to work on architecture. So, we're hiring new people, but we're also having to train these new people, which takes a year to get a DNA analyst online. And during that training period, it takes another DNA analyst to mentor that. And so you're having 2 people that are taken away from current casework. It's kind of what's going on throughout the state. We're having difficulty attracting qualified analysts. A lot of that is due to the cost of living, specifically in Missoula. This is the only crime lab. And wages. And, in the past, we didn't have to compete with private companies, but private companies are here and you're allowed remote work. But the cost of living versus wages is making it difficult to retain staff here.
I will say one other thing that we have that is kind of a complication for us is cold cases, and we didn't mention that here, but cold cases require a lot of extra looking into and work and finding samples and sending them out and communications. And so those can be a huge time suck as well, where we're spent using a person that could be doing casework and trying to solve that cold case.
And with the kind of the forensic genetic genealogy, which has been a game changer for cold cases, we do not do that here at the lab. It's done by private labs, but it has been an absolute game changer for cold cases. But cold cases, they do require some time and effort, but it's a lot of the cold cases we have been working on have gone through the SACI grant, which has been awesome that they've been involved in, but we're happy to facilitate to make sure that evidence is getting tested and making sure that evidence is being tested in the correct way, but it does take time away from current casework. So that's the end of our presentation. I'm going to stop sharing real quick and then I'll turn on the video if anyone has any questions. That was a lot of information dump. So yeah, open it up for questions.
Well, thanks, Jamie. I think I'm actually going to call for a brief break. For me personally, it'll be easier for me to think and ask questions and reflect if we take a quick break. How about Let's take a 10-minute break and come back, well, 11 minutes. We'll come back together at 9:50. We'll be a little bit ahead of schedule on our break, but I think then we can have a little bit more thorough discussion questions.
Sounds great.
Thank you. Hi all, I'm just going to give a 1-minute warning. We'll come back together in about 1 minute. All right, well, we will come back together here. Reconvene the Sexual Assault Response Network Committee. We were talking here, Jamie and Lacey, that you guys are rock stars. We appreciate all the information you presented and the knowledge that you have. And you just make it understandable in common terms. Take the time, so we appreciate that. Wanted to start with questions from the committee. We had asked you to hold them until the end of the presentation. I know Whitney, you had a question. You remember what that is?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the submission form. When the is it law enforcement that fills that out to send to you guys for sex or for the?
Yes, yeah, typically it is. Sometimes you guys will fill out the one for the toxicology kits, but
Oh.
it's generally the law enforcement that fills out that submission form.
And then do they just base it off like the nurse's report on what's in the kit, or is like the kit all one piece of evidence? It doesn't matter how many swabs are in the kit.
That's correct. It's all just one piece of evidence. It comes in as like item 001, and then we'll subitemize it as we analyze it.
Oh, okay. And then last question was, for when you're looking at or thinking about which swabs in the sexual assault kit you test first, do you have a rhyme or reason, or do you test all of them, or what?
We are required to test all of them now, so it doesn't really matter. We just go through it as it's listed on our forms basically and test everything. We used to pick and choose kind of based on the scenario of the case, but since we have started the Y screening process, we've moved to just testing everything that's in there.
Okay, if you ever have any feedback, I think that the medical or the forensic nurses across the state would really appreciate that on what makes your job easier or maybe makes your job more complicated when we're thinking about what swabs we're collecting. And I know you can never go back and collect a swab, so you want to err on the side of caution, but if you ever have any feedback about that, we'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, we actually had talked about doing maybe like a quarterly kind of newsletter for the nurses throughout the state to kind of send out some, hey, these are trends we're seeing, or don't forget to do this kind of thing. But that's still in the infancy stage of planning.
Yeah, well, that's a great idea.
Captain Honeycutt?
Thanks. So I guess I learned a lot watching this, and I guess less of a question, more of a suggestion. Obviously, we've been seeing some of the YTR strains and some of our kits coming back, but not understanding exactly what everything meant until today. So a good job on your presentation, because I learned a tremendous amount. But I think maybe both for this upcoming training with the attorneys and strengthening your sex case, some of these definitions and descriptions you gave on some of what you're doing and how you're doing it would be very important. And or maybe just even an online class for officers to be able to take to read and understand what those results are when they come back from the crime lab. Because we kind of figured it out on like drugs and some of that. We kind of know what the metabolites are and some of that. But with these new cases, you guys are doing a lot of crazy stuff up there. And I know it takes months and months to get this done. But if we don't understand it, it's very difficult to make heads or tails out of what this means when we go to court.
Yeah, so we that's one of the things when I took over the outreach is a big priority for me. We did some training with Great Falls, And we had an online like DNA basics training that we could also do where we sent out a Teams link and officers can join in and we can walk through the results. We also did presented at the Montana Violent Crime Conference, and I might be butchering that name. It was in Billings, but we're always happy to do outreach. There is talk at the laboratory that we've just formed an outreach committee about providing more resources to officers and to attorneys, both prosecution and defense, about what we do through either like a forensic academy class or so we're kind of actively working on trying to get that information out to you guys, but we're open to any suggestions. Or if Eastern Montana, wants some online training, we're happy to provide it. So.
Other questions? I just wanted to mention one of the improvements we made to the new sexual assault kit is to have, and I think I mentioned this at our last meeting, I don't recall exactly, but on the front, the top of the kit, we have a new section where we're asking the nurses to check the boxes of which samples and which steps they've gathered that are pertinent to the batches that the crime lab is putting together so that they can more easily guesstimate how many samples are in the kit that they'll need to test. And so those kits are just rolling out. So the crime lab hasn't gotten a sense yet of how well that will work for them as they try and do a better job of estimating. But that is an improvement we made to the exterior of the kit so that they can more easily at a glance see what the volume is in the kit without having to open it.
Yeah, and I just want to say a huge kudos to Hope there because I gave her my list of things that I wanted to see in sex kits and she made all of them happen. So thank you, Hope. I appreciate that.
It was a team effort. There are a lot of nurses who are listening today who are involved in that, and both Whitney and Emily on the committee too, and Brett and Celine helped with review of all of that. So it really was a huge team effort in making that happen. Other comments or questions today, reflections on this process, even if you don't have a question particularly for Jamie or Lacey?
I will say if you guys think of anything along the way or any questions, we're always happy to answer them. You have my email, Lacey, anyone in the section are more than happy to answer any questions or help in any way. So we're always, can't think of it now, just reach out to us.
Yeah, I just want to say that this was fantastic, and I agree with Honeycutt that some training on what officers are looking at when they get that back would be fantastic. And you guys have always been great. If we have questions, you guys are always there to answer them. So I appreciate that because I don't understand 90% of the stuff I'm looking at until I have you guys explain it. So I've always appreciated that.
And Captain Honeycutt, I appreciate you bringing up that training idea too. That's something that with SARN here in OVS, we can help facilitate training opportunities like that with the lab to assist them with their outreach, particularly to nurses and law enforcement and the prosecutors. So we can collaborate on different ways we might do that. We're doing a quarterly meeting with the nurses and providers who had trained in last year's DOJ sponsored SANE training. And we're looking to expand that out from last year's class to starting to offer that to all examiners around the state, those quarterly meetings. And this could be an easy way to tag into that group and help provide messaging from the lab to that group. Other comments or questions? Okay. Well, if we're ready to move on to the next part of our agenda, we will do so. And I'll just let the public folks know we do have a public comment opportunity coming up later in the meeting toward the end. It was scheduled for noon, but we are running a little ahead of schedule today, about a half hour ahead at least. So I would stay tuned in case that timing comes a little earlier than we have it formally written on the agenda. The next portion of the meeting is a presentation by me talking about the Forensic Rape Examination Payment Program. And I'll have a PowerPoint to share here in a minute, but I just want to lay a little background for this conversation, which is part of your statutory duties as the Sexual Assault Response Network Committee. The legislature specifically asked that you review and look at the processes of the Forensic Rape Examination Payment Program and the amounts that are paid for exams in the state. And so as we kick off this conversation today, you're really aimed at that part of your statutory function. So I just wanted to remind that duty to you as we lay the foundation for these conversations. We expect today to sort of launch a bigger conversation about Montana's overall structure for paying for exams, and would you consider or recommend that any changes be made to that structure? You are the committee that was specifically convened to have those policy discussions and make any recommendations that you might have for the future. So today's presentation, to prepare for it, I reviewed extensively. There was last year released in June, U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO, a report that detailed how other states are providing access to free sexual assault forensic exams as required by the Federal Violence Against Women Act. In that federal act says that patients cannot be billed for the cost of collecting the evidence needed for their case in that forensic exam. I'm going to start to share my screen here, so just a second, please. I'll make sure I get that going correctly. And I was grateful that the GAO had this study that they started working on last year, because that saved me a heck of a lot of work going into this conversation, knowing that we would be preparing to have this conversation. And it's really useful as we think about what Montana's practices are to look at what other states are doing. That's a really standard way to think about how we might move forward in the future, is to look at what other states are doing. This GAO report was a little broader than that. They were specifically trying to pin down to the level of detail that they could what related medical treatments that states were also paying for in addition to the forensic exam, and then how much states were actually paying overall, what the overall costs were. And they got information about how much states reported spending in fiscal year 22. All of the data that we'll be reviewing today is from fiscal year 22. I sent out a summary Excel document to you where I took the GAO report in all of its detail. It had a page per state and all of its practices, and I chewed it down into a single worksheet that hopefully is somewhat usable in terms of filtering and sorting on different columns across the top. And so I hope you were able to at least look at that briefly and maybe even spend a little bit of time with it. But I'm going to walk through it today, and the major highlights that I found in looking at that. And we're really going to focus today on how states are covering the costs of forensic exams and get less into the medical treatments that they might be covering. If you want to take that up in a future meeting, we could come back to that medical treatment side of things. And how much states reported spending overall. I'm not really going to get into today because it really was dependent on their caseload, the population of the state. There's just more people, and so more incidents, and they tend to pay higher amounts in those larger states. But I did take a look. Sorry, just a second here. We've got to do something extra in the room to make sure that the folks in the room can see the presentation as well. The screen that we have here in the conference room does not show the screen share from the Zoom when I'm presenting, which is odd. So now we've got it set up so everybody can see it. What I'm going to start with, I did take a moment in the data that the GAO had rounded up. They looked at the NIBRS data, which is the FBI database for reports of sexual assault to law enforcement. Law enforcement turns around those reports and crunches that data and tells NIBR how many incident reports they received. They're specifically looking at rape, which in Montana would correlate to sexual intercourse without consent in terms of the charge in law. But I took the incidence data that they reported for each state from NIBRS, and I took it at a per capita look. I found the state population for that year and then crunched it a little bit against number of incidents per 1,000 people in the state, just so we could look a little bit. You guys were very interested when we got going about looking at as much sexual assault incidence data as we could, both for Montana and surrounding states. Well, now we get a little bit bigger look at the national picture. And what we found per capita is that Alaska ranks first with 1.34 reports of sexual assault to law enforcement per 1,000 people. And again, these are the reported assaults. This does not cover anything that's unreported, which we know is the vast majority of assaults. The national statistic is about 63% of sexual assaults are not reported to law enforcement. So that's a big gap here, but what we have to look at is that report data. So again, Alaska was first per capita at 1.34. New Jersey was last at 0.167 per 1,000 people. But again, just to point out that the overall payment data doesn't match up when you think about it in these terms, because New Jersey still paid way more than Alaska just because of the total amount of population in the state. And so Alaska paid at fiscal year 22 $500,000 in exam costs, and New Jersey paid 3.5 million based on their data. As we again look at incidence data, the average is 0.445 per 1,000 people per state. Montana is ahead of the average. We're 11th highest at 0.563 per 1,000 people reported to law enforcement. That is behind these states, and I'll take a minute to pause here and look at this list. And what's interesting to me is that other than Arkansas and Michigan at 2 and 3 in this list, these are all Central Plains Western states. You know, this is a really interesting dynamic to me across the United States. And I have not spent time yet digging deeply into why that might be. Maybe you all have the expertise and, you know, have heard information about that before, but that was very interesting to me to see that this is really Central and Western United States that are leading the pack on these
Also
reports.
interesting that the gap between Arkansas and Alaska, like, that's a really, it's what, 0.6?
Yeah, it's a pretty big jump between Arkansas and Alaska. And so, you know, it's hard to know, you know, is it that more sexual assaults are actually occurring per 1,000 people, or more reports are being made? It's really hard to know exactly what's behind these numbers and the context, but it is interesting to look at them together, even though we don't necessarily understand what's leading to the individual states' numbers. I wanted to also revisit the number of, to help set the stage, the number of sexual assault evidence kits that are collected in Montana for survivors. This is our numbers from the kit track system going back to 2014. SACI spent a lot of time after the online kit track system came on in 2019, collecting data on older kits and entering that into the system. So you see how the collection of evidence kits has grown over time. The 2024 numbers, we did see a more than 10% increase in the number of kits collected for survivors in 2024 over 2023. I think that's really great. I can look at the data about the exams and who did the exams and in which facilities, and I see the direct result of that training that DOJ hosted last year with the help of our trainers around the state. You know, they really made a difference in the number of exams being collected. We had new examiners coming on, we had revitalized programs in certain communities, and so that really fed that growth. It's not responsible for all of it, but it really did help in a lot of places, and so that's exciting to see. That bottom line is the number of kits that upon collection are not reported to law enforcement and are instead sent to the Forensic Rape Examination Payment Program at DOJ to hold. I administer that program, and so when those kits are not reported to law enforcement, medical facilities send them to me at our office here in Helena, and we store them in our evidence room. Just a reminder that the 2023 legislature changed the rules for how long we store that evidence. Previously, it was 1 year, and now the legislature says we hold it for 75 years because of the changes that they know have been happening in technology and DNA analysis. but also to allow victims the time to think about what they really want to do with their case and come back later. And we do have victims come back later. What's interesting to me is I've been staying in touch with a researcher at Wichita State, I think is the college name. Forgive me, Kansas folks, if I have just butchered which campus name that is, but what she is finding in her research nationally about what she calls conversion rates from kits that were initially unreported to later reported. Nationally, the average is about 5%. And she's still finalizing her study and her data, but what she can see right now is about 5% nationally. And we are higher than that. We're over time, average about 11% conversion rate, but in the last couple of years, we've been closer to 15%. And so that's something that we don't know exactly why we're so much higher, but she really thinks is remarkable for Montana. So I just wanted to point that out as we think about how our programs are structured. Looking at how we're billing for sexual assault forensic exams in Montana, this is a slide you saw a couple of meetings ago when Whitney and Emily presented on forensic examinations. Again, that Federal Violence Against Women Act requires that exams must be free for victims. They can't be charged for the cost of collecting the evidence. Montana statute does say that they may still be charged for the cost of treatment of any injuries that also occurs at the time of the exam. So that's a distinction for the medical facilities. But what we know from the statute is that local law enforcement is responsible for paying for the cost of the forensic exam and evidence collection if the assault is reported and the kit is reported to law enforcement. If the kit and the assault are not reported, it comes to us, as I said, at FREP, at the Department of Justice, and we're responsible for the cost of that exam, dependent on a legislative appropriation to pay for those costs, which we have had and we've been paying out of state funds through the Crime Victim Compensation Program budget. But the patient, again, may still be billed for the cost of treatment of injuries, even if they're sending their kit to FREP. We do not pay for the cost of those injuries. If a treatment of those injuries, if a victim does report to law enforcement, they are eligible to receive compensation from the Crime Victim Compensation Program to help pay for those expenses, those other medical expenses that they might incur for treatment of injuries. But again, that's not where we're going to spend our time and focus today. We're still going to focus on the cost of the actual exam, the evidence collection. What FREP will reimburse for a cost of an exam is $600 per exam. This amount was set in 2005, an administrative rule, and it has not changed since then. So we're nigh on 20 years now. And at that time, I understand that amount was just kind of an amount that was picked. There wasn't necessarily a lot of study on what actual costs were at the time. And so we also know that that amount that we're paying at FREP really is the threshold and the litmus test for what medical facilities are mostly charging law enforcement when they're responsible for the cost of the exam. I've done a cursory survey of medical facilities around the state, not scientific, have not heard from everyone, nor have I queried everyone, but for the high volume exam facilities, they're typically charging what we're able to pay, the $600 per exam. They're charging that to law enforcement as well, or in some cases less. And so I know that one medical facility is charging more than $600, but that is the outlier. And I've also seen, and I'll talk a little bit, touch just briefly, and we can talk more about this at another future meeting if you're interested, as a next step in our conversation about this issue. But this is $600 is far lower than the average cost of the actual exam for medical facilities. And I can get more into that later, but what I've found is it's more around $2,000, the actual cost of the exam. So looking at the GAO report data that it put together across all states on the payments for exams in other states, I'm going to focus first on who is paying. These are highlights as I reviewed that Excel summary document I put together for you. I broke it down into some further highlights to make it a little bit more digestible. In 32 states, they are paying directly for the exams. 3 of those states do say that victims may consent to have their insurance billed, but again, the victim themselves, cannot be billed for any balance for the cost of the forensic exam. 8 more states pay if the victim is uninsured or for expenses that aren't covered by their insurance. And then additionally, 2 more states pay for exams if they're not reported to law enforcement, and that includes us and Colorado. At the county level, there are 4 states where counties are required to pay, and you see them listed here: Kansas, Arizona, Hawaii, and South Dakota. Nevada also, the counties pay, but then there's a reimbursement opportunity with the state where the state will pay them for up to 10 exams per year or $10,000 per fiscal year. I don't have a sense of, what that covers for a typical county in Nevada based on their exam volume. Obviously, more rural counties aren't using as much as some of the more populated counties. In New Jersey, they have a different system where counties are paying, but they're doing it through a state administered fund that collects revenue from court fees for convicted offenders. And the way that their statute for that fund is set up, they assess when someone's convicted of sexual assault an $800 penalty. And that $800 penalty from the offender is what goes into that fund to pay for the cost of those exams. And as I mentioned earlier, in fiscal year 22, New Jersey did pay $3.5 million for exams. Now, there are 2 states that require law enforcement to pay for reported exams, which kind of surprised me that we were such an outlier in that way. So I did want to highlight that. In California, law enforcement pays initially, but is then reimbursed by the state. And California has an interesting system that I assume is meant to incentivize reporting cases to law enforcement instead of having them remain anonymous. It's an $1,100 reimbursement that law enforcement will receive if the case is reported to them and the investigation proceeds. But if the case is not reported, it's just over $900 that they receive in reimbursement from the state. And so I thought that was interesting. And California is one of a few states that requires evidence collected to be given to law enforcement, regardless of whether the crime is going to be reported and investigated further. Pennsylvania and Utah, you'll see in the notes column in the Excel workbook, they are those other states where that's the case. The evidence has to be given to law enforcement, regardless of whether the investigation is pursued. In Ohio, all assaults also have to be reported to law enforcement, but again, the adult survivor can choose to remain anonymous. And I'm not sure exactly how that works. They're giving evidence over to law enforcement, but still staying anonymous or saying I'm not officially reporting. I did not delve further into understanding that, but I wanted to let you know that some states have that arrangement. Also want to bring up on this page that Wyoming previously was a state that was charging law enforcement, that law enforcement was responsible for the cost of exams, but they changed the law in 2019, and they specifically noted in their data collection with the GAO report that they did that over concern that smaller law enforcement agencies may have been worried about their constrained budgets and discouraged survivors from requesting exams. And so now the state is paying in Wyoming using a combination of federal and state funds to cover the cost of those exams instead of having law enforcement be responsible for the cost. Moving now into how states are paying, I'm going to focus first on the funds that they're using, and predominantly they're using federal funds in combination with something else. There are 2 states that are exclusively using federal funds, Maine and Rhode Island, and they're using Federal Victims of Crime Act formula grant funds. Those are VOCA funds for short. And those funds, the revenue source is predominantly the offender-generated revenue, criminal fines and fees, surcharges, and forfeited bail bonds. 23 other states are using those same federal funds, but in combination with other federal funds or state funds. So 14 of those states that are using the VOCA formula grant funds are combining that with a different state victim of crime fund. I don't have a definition of what that revenue source might be for those state victims of crime funds. It's different than the general appropriation funds because that was reported separately in the GAO report. There were 11 states that were combining state general purpose or revenue funds with those federal FOCA grants to pay for their exams. I did reach out to the GAO a couple of times trying to see if I could better understand what they qualified as state victims of crime funds, and I did not receive a response yet. So if I do, I'll let you know in the future. California is a standout in terms of the federal funds it uses. It is using federal Stop Violence Against Women formula grant funds, which is a different source of federal funding, but they're the only state using those Stop Violence Against Women funds in this way to pay for forensic exams. When state funds are used, there are 18 states that are exclusively using state funds, no federal funding involved. And of those 6 states are exclusively using, again, that term, the state victims of crime funds, that I don't have a clear definition on what those are. 7 states are exclusively using their state general purpose funds or revenue funds. Here in Montana, we call those the state general fund. There are 2 states that are exclusively using a combination of those 2 types of funds, so using both. There are 9 states that have generated other types of revenue that they're using as state funds to cover the cost of their exams, and those get into some interesting options in a couple of cases. I've listed them here. Alabama just is standardly using fines, fees, and restitution. There are 3 states that have been using restitution as a source of funding for exam costs. Georgia's using DUI fines and probation and parole fees. Iowa is also pulling in inmate wages. They're the only one that I found doing that in the GAO report. Kentucky's using traffic fees and court costs. Maine's one of the states using restitution. New Jersey, again, I talked about that fund where they're actually fining convicted sexual offenders $800 for their offense, and it goes into that fund that pays and reimburses the counties for the cost of exams. New Mexico is unique in that it's using Department of Health and Mental Health funds for the cost of their exams. And then North Dakota also a unique situation because they're using insurance regulatory trust funds. And so I don't know if Whitney, you saw that when you were in your North Dakota time, if that's a recent change since you were in North Dakota, but that they were the only state using insurance regulatory trust funds. So how much they're paying, I didn't, again, focus on the totals because it's just hard to compare apples to apples because of the difference in state populations. So I focused instead on the information the GAO gathered about whether a state is capping what they'll pay for an exam. 9 states have no cap. You see the list there. 30 states do have a cap. 11 states did not report whether they had a cap or not. But when I looked at the cap data, Colorado had the highest cap at $5,000. And if I recall correctly, that cap could also go toward not just the cost of the exam, but also any related medical expenses. Nebraska and Iowa had the lowest at $500. Montana and Alabama are just ahead of that with the next lowest cap of $600. And again, that $600 technically applies in Montana to the unreported cases that come to FREP. But it is a threshold that medical facilities are leaning on as they think about what they're charging law enforcement here. The average cap was $1,355. The median cap was just over $1,000 when I ran the numbers. This does exclude Utah and Virginia, because if you take a look at theirs, their information in the Excel sheet is pretty interesting. They have kind of a bifurcated cap system. Just moving ahead in my notes here so I can talk to you a bit about that. But if you have the Excel sheet in front of you, you can see it. In Utah, they have it broken down so that they're paying differently between exams with photo documentation. They'll pay $1,250 for exams with photos, but if there are no photos, they only pay $625. They do have an additional payment that they'll make for emergency room use up to $350, and then they do allow remaining allowable charges to be paid at 50% without a total cap. In Virginia, it's sliced differently. They're paying, they differentiate between acute and non-acute exams. And so for acute exams, they're paying 60% of eligible charges. for acute exams, and they say that's those performed within 120 hours of the assault, which is generally the national guideline for collecting physical evidence, or at least swabs. But we do know from the national protocol now that it's really in the hands of the examiner to determine what's appropriate for that case based on the individual circumstances, whether they go past 120 hours with evidence collection. But getting back to Virginia, for non-acute exams that are performed after 120 hours, they are still paying $1,500 per exam. So it was interesting just to see how states are breaking that down. Virginia is also paying $1,000 for follow-up exams, and I don't know what is included in that and how they've defined what those follow-up exam costs might be, but could dig into that more if you wanted to. Now, before I move on to just general report conclusions from the GAO report, any questions at this point on anything I've covered? I kind of zoomed through that. There's a lot to look at in that Excel workbook, and I tried to make it as digestible as possible, but frankly, it's just a lot of data. So I wanted to offer an opportunity to just pause for a second here. I'm not going to stop my screen share just because it's complicated to get it going again, but any questions from anybody at this time? And I can't see you very well, so if you'd either just go ahead and open up your mic and ask your question or raise your hand. I can see the hand flag right now.
Another comment on the non-acute exams, a lot of times that's for kid cases with late disclosure. So that could happen, you know, a week later, a month later, a year later, or multiple years later. They still recommend having that medical exam done.
And an interesting point related to that for Montana is for FREP, at least, we're only paying if there's a kit collected. And so if a kit is not collected, but you're still doing a forensic exam for a delayed report, that's something that we can't reimburse you for. Any other questions or comments out there?
Yeah, this is Christina. Maybe we could put that on Hope for consideration, because that is a problem with the kid exams.
You're saying, Christina, something that you'd like the committee to consider is paying for those exams, even if a kit isn't collected or if it's a delayed report?
Yeah, paying for, I mean, we might look into it with I'm really interested in the Virginia follow-up exams, and we might look into that coupling. You know, a common thing we do now is we do it through well child exams and see if we have the chance for forensic evidence gathering. It's just more complicated, so that if there was a way that we could assure at least one follow-up medical exam that for kid cases, that would be super helpful, actually.
Okay.
I hope this is Brenda. My question would be, when you gathered this data, is it specific to adult sex assault? And the reason I ask that is twofold. I know that Utah has a very different sort of mechanism for the child exams. And then one of the states said they use the VAWA, which is really violence against women. And there's some, you know, very clear lines about this is for adults and VOCA's for kind of for kids. So do you know if generally this was for all exams for any sex assault, kids and adults, or was it more focused across the board on the adults exams?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that clarification, Brenda, on the funding sources, because I wasn't aware of that typical distinction. But no, this did collect information for pediatric and adult exams. So in Maryland's information, for instance, on their cap, which I did not highlight, I'm sorry, they don't have a cap for exam costs, but they did note that their pediatric services that were provided by child advocacy centers was capped at $80 per hour for up to 5 hours of treatment and interview time. So that was a specific circumstance that was mentioned. So my assumption with that, and then I'm looking to see also, just searching the Excel sheet, that's how I have to work through this. There's another state here, North Dakota, for instance, mentioned in its notes that they can reimburse an accredited child advocacy center for providing a forensic interview at 80%. And then the Attorney General's office would pay the remaining 20% for the interview, in addition to paying for the cost of the exam. So that was a distinction they made. I didn't pull it out in the presentation because it was talking about the forensic interview. So I do believe the way that they looked at this did include child and adult data for cost of exams.
New York,
Oh,
under 18.
Kayla's pointing out something about New York. What do you see there, Kayla?
So New York's, they reported they'll pay $2,500 for exams with or without a kit for survivors under 18.
Thank you. Yeah, so New York and North Carolina I'm seeing here, and I don't know why I didn't think to include them. But they also bifurcated their reimbursement schedule. So New York will reimburse $800 for an exam conducted without a kit. They'll reimburse $1,200 for exams with a kit, $1,500 for exams with or without a kit for survivors who are 18 and older, and there's partial HIV prophylaxis treatment included because that prophylaxis is so expensive. I've been hearing in my conversations with our medical facilities. And then they, as Kayla just said, they'll pay $2,500 for exams with or without a kit for survivors under 18. And then what did that say? In full. There's something I can't see. And with full HIV prophylaxis treatment for those exams. North Carolina is also bifurcated, and they're doing $600 for exam providers, $500 for hospital or facility fees, and then $400 for other eligible expenses related to the exam. So Brenda, I think it's safe to say they did ask about pediatric and adult data.
Great, thanks. I do think Utah's a little different. I used to be the chapter director there, so we started this program when I was there. They actually get money from the legislature to contract with Primary Children's Hospital, and they hire nurse practitioners and train them and then put them in the accredited CACs there. So there's probably a little bit of difference in that because the state funding would go towards paying for the actual practitioners and the costs associated instead of on a reimbursement basis. But I say that because I think it's a really great thing, and hopefully maybe someday we could consider something like that since we have challenges in our rural areas.
Yeah, the GAO report, I was limited to seeing what it was they had rounded up in the report. And so those contextual details by state, if there's something you'd like me to pick on and do some more research into, this would be a good time for me to do that. I didn't have the time for today. So, I can look more into detail at programs like that to see what we might bring forward. Other comments or questions? Okay. I will go back to my roundup here on the GAO report. Moving to the next slide. The report conclusions, there was a section spent on data gaps that they identified. They could not determine the total costs and payments made in each state just because of the way that the states sometimes were collecting their data. But particularly when exams are paid by counties or law enforcement, there's just no single entity tracking the data, including in Montana. I'm starting to do some work on trying to put together the whole picture of the cost of exams, or at least what law enforcement is charged for exams here, in addition to what FREP is charged, to see if we can put together a better picture of the costs in Montana. But that is a big data gap that the GAO identified. They also identified that not all payers collect complete data about how much they pay for exams, so that contributed. And then some recorded payment amounts are commingled with other medical expenses. They aren't distinguishing between what's treatment for injuries or other things versus the cost of the exam itself. There were also, they pointed out, no uniform billing code associated with sexual assault forensic exams, which I certainly have noticed in looking at invoices from medical facilities in Montana. Every facility bills it a little bit differently. Some are charging for the ER room, some are charging just a general sort of, I think they call it a legal case fee. So there are different distinctions, and that's something that we could spend more time on at a future meeting if you wanted me to dig more into the detailed invoices that I have to look more about how Montana facilities are charging it. Some medical facilities are also charging exams at reduced rates. And so while we know it costs them more, there are some facilities here in Montana that just bill a flat rate for the $600, for instance, that they know will pay, or they're charging their law enforcement agencies a flat fee that might be lower or different than that $600. And they're not giving a detailed invoice just because it's simpler for them in billing to give a flat fee. We do know that a lot of the facilities are writing off portions of the exam costs as what's listed here in the GAO report. It was called charity care, but in Montana, it's called community benefit now. I forget which year that's changed, whether it was 2017 or 2019-ish. But that is that community benefit that you might have heard about previously. Other report conclusions from the GAO, they looked at promising practices for ensuring that survivors are receiving free exams, and some highlights that they pulled out from what they heard back from states was that there are examples like Wyoming where state funding and reimbursement is being used to ease the budget constraints on local jurisdictions in hopes of preventing chilling effects on access to exams. They also pointed to states where a single payer model is used to ensure consistent and prompt payment to medical facilities. It's also simpler for medical facilities to know who they have to pay or who they have to invoice, pardon me. I spend time on the phone right now with medical facilities in Montana who are sorting between, okay, what's a SARN case that was reported to FREP and what was reported to law enforcement. There's a particular medical facility that I'm on the phone with, frequently, a few times a month. Is this a FREP case? Is this not a FREP case? And so for those states with a single payer model they talked about, it just makes the billing simpler. They also felt it added extra protection for survivors' personal information. Establishing agreements was another highlight between states and primary insurance in those states, so that they were had a formal agreement and understood and had specific outreach with the insurance companies that survivors should not be billed for the balance, and that the insurance companies also knew and the medical facilities knew that the state would cover the costs not paid by insurance so that the patient never received a bill. They, in some states, are using itemized statements for exams and treatments so that the billing staff can clearly see what charges are appropriate to be billed for survivors for the treatment of medical injuries, for instance, or pardon me, treatment of injuries during the exam versus the cost of the exam and the evidence collection. And then development of statewide standards for counties providing services to survivors. That was really the New Jersey example. They've got an interesting thing there, and it sounds maybe analogous, Brenda, to what Utah is doing. Let me pull up my note on that real quick. New Jersey, each county has a sexual assault response team, and a survivor can seek treatment at any healthcare facility. And there's some sort of network between those facilities and the county sexual assault response team, which was not detailed well enough for me to understand it. I'd need to go do some more research, but they did point out not all facilities had their own individual sexual assault response team or provided specialized services. And so I'd need to do a little bit more learning to understand what they felt like those statewide standards for counties provided and offered an enhancement. The last one they pointed out was just strong partnerships and coordination between payers and exam providers was evident in talking with states about how they're trying to ensure that patients don't get billed for the cost of the exams, is that states are making a proactive effort to work closely together and make sure that those billings aren't happening for patients.
Hope for New Jersey, I do know that their forensic nurses are actually employed by the county attorney's office. And so then they're basically work out of that office and then are dispatched to hospitals as needed. And that's how their response works throughout the majority of New Jersey.
Good to know. Thank you.
I guess I didn't really understand how small New Jersey is. I'm like, how would that work if you're all out of one office? But it's a small state.
It's not that hard to get top to bottom to New Jersey. It's like going maybe from, I don't know, Sydney to Miles City or
Yeah.
Billings, maybe. Yeah. Other comments or questions? At this time, I'll stop my screen share.
I was just gonna mention that I think talking about the cost of it and then the process of billing for it is very different if that exam happened in a hospital versus a clinic versus a child advocacy center. When you think about a hospital, there's typically more costs associated with being in an ER than there is in a clinic or a child advocacy center. And when you think about the billing process, I think it's a lot easier for someone in a clinic setting to have control over that billing than the hospital. When I think about billing in our hospital, sexual assault cases is such a small piece of it that it almost gets overlooked or brushed aside, like, well, this only happens, so many times a year compared to other things that present that our billing people are preoccupied with. That I think it's harder in those bigger facilities compared to smaller. And then I was also gonna say, I remember this being an issue in North Dakota. I don't know if issue is the right word, but sometimes there would be multiple charges per patient at different facilities. So if a patient presented to a hospital and they had their EMTALA completed, and then the hospital said, we don't have a forensic nurse to do this exam, you're gonna have to transfer to another hospital. There would technically be 2 charges for 1 patient, and some states allow that to happen and some states don't allow that to happen.
I'll just note, we do have an attendee with their hand up right now. We'll save that for the public comment section. If you want to hang tight with us and you can offer, we won't engage in a question answer session during the public comment period, but you could let us know what your thought was during that time and share that for the committee to think about. Other comments and questions for the committee? Okay. I'd like to go around the table, the virtual table here, if I could. And as we think about moving this conversation forward and how we might best move this conversation forward, as you think about how Montana's system is structured and where we might go from here, Christina and Brenda have both offered some thoughts, and Whitney, about, pieces of context that we might look for in this conversation. Does anybody have any particular asks that they'd like to make? When we come back together in March, I expect to bring back sort of a 2.0 round of information to you to help further this conversation. And I wonder what you would find most helpful in that 2.0 conversation when we come back together in March to help keep this conversation going and moving forward.
The state of Washington has a new piece of legislature that was approved that requires hospitals provide NPEP to patients, the full course of NPEP, prior to their discharge. Is that anything that we could consider? Like, what mechanisms are they using and how would we make that available to patients? Because like in the city of Bozeman, I know often the hospital is the only pharmacy that has that medication. And so, like, if they're at another facility, they then have to come here for things, like specifically that medication. And so how do we make it more accessible?
Emily, I'd be interested to hear what they do for their rural communities. When you think about those medications do expire, they have a shelf life. And if every pharmacy or every hospital is required to keep that, is that like fiscally makes sense for small critical access hospitals to have that medication if they're not doing SARN exams? That's just interesting, I think.
I also think the reality is most hospitals have to have some of that medication, because if there's an accidental needle stick, it's the same medications that we're starting for that situation as a exposure following a sexual assault or possible exposure. So I'm not sure how much that plays into it, but I just think it would be interesting to dive a little bit deeper into how they made that happen.
I would agree, and I know we suffer here. If our SARN nurse at the county health nurse does the exam, the patient still ends up going to the hospital to get those prescription meds because they have to be administered by a doctor. And so that's always the, multiple trips to, different hospitals. We get multiple billing situations. And of course, who's paying the bill has always been a big, fear for some of these folks that don't have any money or don't have insurance. So I'm hoping that maybe that between that and maybe the telehealth portion of this, where maybe we require every hospital to provide SARN exams and not, the heartbreaking, well, we can't do that here. You have to drive 4 hours to get to the next place that does it. Maybe we can utilize that telehealth piece to make this a single billing situation and open it up for everybody to get the treatment that they need immediately.
Other thoughts on what pieces of the conversation, how we might expand this as we move forward and progress?
I guess, Hope, I'm starting to think about like what authority we have as a legislative committee and what the processes look like. Correct me if I'm wrong, it looks like we have rulemaking authority. And the FREP program is, the guidelines are under the Montana administrative rules, which doesn't look like, from my like quick research here, those guidelines haven't been changed since 2005.
Yeah.
I would be interested in learning what, and I have some administrative, I've taken classes, but I know enough to be dangerous with NAPA. I'd be interested in learning like what that process looks like and what we have to do to start actively making changes here.
I wonder if it would be helpful to revisit the FREP statute and go over what the current rules are. And then also talk through the actual process of what's happening and get comments on that. I think maybe by the next meeting, if we have more information on the law enforcement piece, I don't want to get too down in the weeds in like different types of services and things like that until we understand what's happening now on payment structure, and given that foundation.
So you're saying come back with more detail on the law enforcement side and the FREP side of
Just how the current response now, what that's looking like. We could go through the FREP rules. They are outdated. And that's why we're having the conversation, but just given more of a foundation of that and the actual response now. And then we can also, I know that someone's mentioned Utah, Virginia, there are some states that we can maybe look at a little closer and provide some follow-up information. I don't know if that makes sense. But...
From an IHS perspective on some of this, and something that I've been thinking about for a while now, is with the FREP and with the reimbursement options. IHS at this point in time, it is not considered a medical emergency that needs to be treated. If you are not a beneficiary or you're not eligible for CARES at IHS, so Caucasians, anybody that is not of Native descent, they can get stabilized, and then they'll usually get transferred to a different area. They don't get the sexual assault exam locally. And so with the reimbursement portions or the way that we define this within our state, it could be something, if we have the eligibility or the ability to provide these cares locally, we don't need to transfer that person to another area. I mean, we're going to get the reimbursement for it. We can apply for that. How do we see and allow our law enforcement officers, our FBI, to just bring them to that closest instead of having to take them further away for these examinations?
Heather, what's the status of that conversation at the IHS level?
So with the issues that we've been having with everything else, that's kind of been tabled until we can get the training and everything set up and provide these services locally. It is one that I intend to pursue because I feel this is an emergency situation, whether it's they're not, you know, critically injured, but I think it's on a psychological basis. This is not something you want to traumatize somebody by taking them further. So it's something that I'm bringing to the table to try to make sure that any law enforcement officer, if it's the closest facility, they can bring that child, that adult in, whether they are eligible to receive services at IHS or not. And that's going to make it a lot easier for these cases that you're having to take them to Billings or say Miles City. We had one for there, they needed to bring it to us. It just allows for that combined effort between all of these facilities locally, and we're not having to make these survivors go further outside of a comfort level to receive the care. So it's on the table. It's just kind of down the road for me with all the battles that we tend to fight.
Yeah, well, we'll appreciate you keeping us updated on that. You know, obviously the state cannot compel the IHS facilities to change that policy, but certainly appreciate knowing that that conversation is happening, being reminded of that you're thinking about that concept. Other thoughts, questions before we move into seeking public comment?
I wanted to kind of piggyback off of what Captain Honeycutt said about requiring hospitals to do SANE exams. I mean, I totally understand where we're coming from on that. We don't want people to travel. But I know that there are providers in hospitals that I wouldn't want them to do an exam on me for many reasons. And so when you say that they have to do SANE exams, I want us to just be careful of that, because especially when we talk about pediatric patients, you know, you have to do this exam. Really, they can be traumatized a lot more by someone doing a bad job than they are by traveling. And I get that each situation is different, but I just want to make sure that we address that. And we want quality exams being done, not just exams being done.
And quality in terms of patient care, obviously, but then also in terms of evidence collection and that sort of thing, because, and I can see both sides of what's being said here, but both of those, we can't just have anyone doing a SANE exam because it might not be done to the right standards, and then we'll have a prosecution problem down the road.
And the kit is very user friendly, and it's that way for a reason. On which, and it's better now too with the new adjustments that we made. I think that it's a lot more clear, but just keeping that in mind, yeah, just keeping that in mind.
And I guess my comment would be, is it is an injustice in kid cases that, and it is an injustice for law enforcement when the responsibility to want to get an exam is a financial impact on our law enforcement agency's budget. That, you know, that a kid can't get that level of care. There's not a funding source for it unless a law enforcement agency orders it and is responsible for paying for it. And I have to say, Child Protective Services has been a great partner in our kid cases and has been able to step up and pay for some of those exams. So I guess, you know, if FREP wouldn't kick in on a kid case because a kit wasn't administered, there's a population out there that might not be getting care just because of, you know, a financial impact that is really the burden of law enforcement. That's really not law enforcement's responsibility. So just to kind of keep that at the forefront as we're looking at, you know, just all of this.
Yeah, I've noted that, Brenda. Other comments? And I do want to recognize that Cody Talbot is with us. She joined at about 8:30. So hello, Cody. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Hope.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if there are no other comments, questions from the committee, we will transition to our public comment period. And so we do have a handful of folks with us here, about a dozen who have joined to listen. I appreciate that interest. If you at this time would be interested in making a comment to the committee, again, this is not a Q&A session, but if you have questions that you would like the committee to consider, certainly you can pose them, and we can incorporate that potentially into how we proceed with this work. But we're very interested in hearing what the attendees might have for feedback on any of the matters you've heard this morning or anything under the jurisdiction of the committee. Please press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to make a comment at this time.
Hope,
And we
Hope,
yeah.
Can I jump in? This is Ben Ulick. I'm sorry, I got cut off. I lost service for a little bit, so I jumped back in as just a participant right away. And I couldn't jump in during the panelist section. Just a couple comments with medications. Some hospitals only have inpatient pharmacy privileges. So when victims present to ERs, they're unable to prescribe and give medications out in the ER as an outpatient. So there's some limitations in some smaller critical access hospitals that do not have inpatient, outpatient pharmacies. So there's a little bit of limitations due to their licensures through the state pharmacy. So that would play a little bit into what some hospitals would be able to prescribe and give out in the ER. So that would play a little bit into what we could be able to do in hospitals as well.
I appreciate that context. That's really good to know. Did you have anything else you wanted to share or ask, Ben?
No, that was it. Just that clarification. Just not all pharmacies are equal across the state within hospitals.
Yeah. No, that's important for us to know. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, I am not seeing hands raising amongst our public members. Oh, we have a brave soul who has raised their hand. Let's see. That is, I cannot tell who it is. Anybody else on the Zoom, can y'all see whose hand is raised? I see that one hand is raised, but I can't tell who it is.
It's Rachel Goodman Williams.
Thank you very much. For recognizing Rachel Goodman Williams, please go ahead. If you would identify yourself and who you represent, if it's someone other than yourself.
Sure. So hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to join the meeting. I'm Rachel Goodman Williams. I'm a professor at Wichita State University. Most of my research focuses on non-report SAC options for sexual assault victims. So FREP kits in Montana. And I just want to say, I think the discussion that you all are having today is so important. And one of the things that came up that I just wanted to voice my support for was really thinking about how to balance access with quality of care, and this tension between helping people get care in an easily accessible way and knowing that all hospitals are not equally equipped to do these exams and to do them well. Currently, I'm working on some research with a forensic nursing program in Maryland. They're the only hospital in the county that provides sexual assault kits. And I'm doing interviews with survivors who chose the FREP kit option at that hospital. And a lot of them got transferred from other hospitals. They went to another hospital first and then got transferred to this one. And the difference in their experiences at these different hospitals has been really profound. A lot of them saying their experience at the first hospital, you know, who didn't do these kits or wasn't well trained to do these kits was often really negative. And then when they got transferred over to a hospital that has a much more robust program, had really positive experiences there. And so there is, you know, of course, this balance between access and quality of care. But I think that's a really important conversation to keep having, particularly when it comes to FREP kits and making sure that survivors who aren't sure if they want to report right away understand all of their options and understand what that non-report option looks like. There can be a lot of variation jurisdiction from jurisdiction to how many people choose that PrEP kit option. And I think part of that really has to do with how it's being presented to them. And if it's being presented to them, is it being presented as sort of an equal option? Or is it not being mentioned unless somebody explicitly asks for it? So all really important conversations to be having. This was a pleasure to sit in and listen to. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Any other public members who have any comments or would like to provide feedback to the committee at this time? Please do press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen and we will recognize you. And we'll recognize Mary Pat Hansen.
Can you hear me?
Sure can.
I'm going to do my best to keep my comments short, but I have lots of thoughts. I'll start on the payment end of things. Been running a program.
Mary Pat, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Would you first identify yourself and where you're from?
Sure. My name is Mary Pat Hansen. I am a nurse practitioner. I run First Step, which is our program in Missoula, Montana. We are both a children's advocacy center and an adult sexual assault response center. So we bridge the world of non-acute response and acute response. We have 24/7 access in an outpatient clinic. I've been here for almost 20 years, and I will tell you, I have watched the problem around payment look different over those 20 years, and it has never been simple. And I am grateful to work for an organization that is committed to making sure that our clients are not paying for our services. But I will tell you that is a unique situation that I am in, and one that I am getting continued pressure to decrease the cost of our program to our hospital. I could talk about the problems with healthcare and reimbursement right now, but it is just ugly and messy, and hospitals are not doing well. All that said, if I could have a vote, we could simplify the payment process, where the payment process does not have anything to do with a local law enforcement agency paying for it, does not have anything to do with whether or not someone reports or doesn't report. Certainly, it could have a tiered reimbursement rate, meaning if evidence is collected, you're reimbursed more than if evidence is not collected because of the complexity that goes up in that. But reimbursement is also not related to whether or not it's an adult or a child. It just, anyone in our state that is seeking care after sexual abuse or sexual assault can receive that care, and that we have some sort of process to reimburse at a rate potentially based on the complexity of the case, and not related to local law enforcement. I have seen over the years such good intent. Everyone wants to do right, but it is true that if you're in rural Montana and you have a set budget, you may, quote, offer a sane exam to your client, but you might offer that differently if you don't have the money to pay for it. So you might say the option, but then sway the choice that the client is going to make. Again, I believe in the goodwill. I actually love working in the world that we work in, because in a crazy divided country that we're in right now, this is one we all agree on, right? Like, people who have experienced sexual violence or child abuse should get the care that they need. So it's a very simple one. I think that's my commentary on payment. I think at one point Whitney shared with us a payment system that looked similar to what I'm talking about. Maybe not quite in its full breadth, but I think Whitney would be a great person to rely on to talk about like a reimbursement that isn't based on whether or not someone's reporting or not reporting. And then as far as, I guess I'm just going to echo the quality comment that Whitney, and then I think it was Rachel, I think that was her name, but sometimes just having greater access or more people providing sane care is not always the answer. It's making sure that people who are providing the care are providing it really well, and that we can get them to those people. I'm impressed that Heather's taken on the telehealth world. I think it's a world that we probably need to explore a little more across the state. I'm excited about that. I have been intrigued by it, but have not taken on the process of developing that program here yet. I think that's it. I had one other comment, but I lost it. Shoot. If I think of it again, I'll re-raise my hand. I appreciate you guys listening. I appreciate the work that you're doing. You may or may not know this, but we have needed some sort of a collaborative look at this work in the state. And I'm so happy that it's here. Like, I'm so delighted that you're all taking the time to serve on this committee. Thank you for your service and trying to make this work better for our clients across the state.
Thanks, Mary Pat. Annalise Wilson, if you'd please introduce yourself and identify who you're with and represent if it's someone other than yourself.
Hi, my name is Annalise Wilson, and I am the SARN coordinator at Logan Health Kalispell. And I just am going to kind of tail off of what Mary Pat said. We absolutely are appreciative of this group and that you guys are working together to help better sexual assaults response in the state of Montana. I also would like to see a simple payment process and have it removed from our local law enforcement. I agree with Mary Pat that I do feel like at times it is a burden to our departments, and that does kind of lead to how they discuss what options are available for a patient. And I never want that to be a barrier for a patient coming. Again, there are a few hospitals that are very supportive of their SARN programs in the state of Montana. And I think Whitney and Hope and Emily and Mary Pat, we all work for places that do have this as a priority. But healthcare is ever changing, and being able to be a community service that is a burden on the hospital, it's a huge undertaking. And with Mary Pat, I would agree. We are just always hopeful that and thankful that every year they continue to do our community service and allow us to be able to provide this care to our patients. And so I think moving forward, coming up with a payment program that is a little bit more helpful for the cost of the exams for the medications will be beneficial in the long run. So thank you for your time.
Thanks for your comment. If there's anyone else in the public attendees, if you'd raise your hand now so that we know that you're interested in making a public comment at this time. Everyone is welcome. Well, not seeing any more hands at this time. Committee, are you interested in any follow-up discussion? Any comments, things that you'd also like me to look at in light of anything that you heard that we haven't yet discussed or directed me to think about as we move into our next phase of this conversation for our March meeting?
I just have one thing real quick, Hope. I did receive from you, and I think Heather as well, the application for the SARN nurse training. I believe it was over there in Bozeman in April. I applied for that, but it was a really pleasantly interesting application. I didn't hear anything back though.
I will make sure that we have you connected on email with the training director for the grant program. I know that they've had some ups and downs with recent, just waiting to see what's happening with federal funding. And so maybe there's a piece related to that, but
oh, sure. That makes
we'll
sense.
make sure to get you connected in the email.
Thank you.
And make sure, yeah, that you've got the latest info. Other comments or discussion from the committee about what you'd like to see in March and as we take this forward?
I would just like to thank Annalise and Mary Pat for calling out like the need for that simplified billing process. Like, I had to sit down with the biller at Bozeman who does the billing for these exams. And she's like, I have up to like 15 to 20 entities that I could be billing for these exams, and trying to figure out how all of that works. And there's a process that's slightly different for each of those agencies or entities and what that looks like. And while we're like a small population of what the hospital serves, the fact that so much of her billing time is devoted to taking care of this billing process is a lot of work, and it's a big ask for the hospital to also dedicate that resource. And so if we did have a mechanism that was like one place for payment, send bill, done, it would be so much easier system wide. And then I think it does take that burden off of our law enforcement partners of like, what's in the budget today? If that is a consideration from them, as well as if we were able to expand that for patients who are coming in for care, because I have patients who come in on day 6 and they just want to make sure their body's healthy, but they don't have the means to afford that exam. So like, how do we help those people as we move forward? Does it have to be tied to kit collection, or can we look at that tiered structure of, you know, we have this piece of evidence collection that we can bill for versus we have this medical forensic that is also making sure bodies are healthy and safe, which may add like a layer of complication. But if we can get it through one billing source, I think that would help smooth things out a lot.
Can I add another thing I had thought about, Emily reminded me or made me think about it, is I hope that we can somehow put into the rules regarding this billing is that it doesn't matter where the crime happened. Because we do have patients who cross state lines who come to Montana for an exam. And so I don't want that to be a barrier to somebody if they were maybe assaulted in Wyoming or one of the Dakotas or Idaho, and they come to us for forensic care. And then since the crime didn't happen here, we're not gonna pay for that. I do know that that's how South Dakota works, and it's really difficult. It's a barrier. And so I just hope that that's not a barrier, in our state. Or we have patients who go somewhere on vacation and it happens, and then they come back and they need an exam, or they're in a big city where it happens, they don't know where to go, and so they wait to get back to their hometown hospital. And so if that could just be thought about as well, that'd be appreciated.
Thanks for
I
that
would
extra. Sorry, go
I
ahead.
would like to request, and we had mentioned it, if there's a way that we can work together on the standardization of the billing and coding on how we look at it as a state, because billing and coding within IHS is going to be completely different than any of you guys are going to see. So I have to have a standard set up before I start proposing that we start seeing non-BIN patients or non-native patients. I have to have that all outlined, and it's if we're talking about it in the future and we're doing it kind of along the same lines, I think I'll have a lot more support on my end to push that forward.
Hope, I just like to add, I think you did a beautiful job of summarizing all of that information in that spreadsheet because it was a lot. And I guess my 2 cents might be, it's one thing to say, let's look at consistent billing, but it's tied to payment. It's tied to money available. It's tied to does the state subsidize the medical facilities? Does victims comp? Do you use federal grants? Do you use a mix? So you're kind of, what Whitney said about serving somebody from another state. So I just wonder, just a suggestion might be to narrow that scope down, to look at some of the states that have statewide programs like Utah, like Massachusetts, where they're providing a statewide program for all of these situations, pediatric, adults, and they're finding the funding for it and they're being consistent about it. It might just help us to narrow down and look at not only just let's do consistent billing, because that could be crazy across, like Heather just said, across all the systems, but how do you develop a program where you can support it too, right? And who's responsible for supporting it? I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
At some point in the conversation, it will make sense to have a conversation about the current funding for exams here when we pay for FREP and what the funding source is within the Office of Victim Services. And so that you have a sense of what the current universe looks like on that versus if we were to take this program in another way and propose a different payment structure, what would be needed to support that. And so I don't know if we'd get to that in March, but it could be part of the discussion maybe at our June in-person meeting.
I think what I'm hearing is one, looking at the current law and rules on PrEP, and then maybe the first part of that meeting in March, diving into more specific states. I think Brenda had a good idea there on looking at the statewide programs, but also if there's between now and then, if a committee member sent in particular state or information they were interested in or want to learn more about, we can look at those, but kind of diving a little bit deeper into the GAO data.
And really what it'll be is leaping from the GAO data into more state-specific information, because the GAO data, the way that they reported it is, it's pretty surface level. They were trying to standardize, I think, how they were reporting state to state. And so in that standardization of how they were showing the data, I think we lost a lot of context. And so I appreciate the programs that you've called out. And I'll take some time to delve more into those and come back and talk more about those structures for comparison.
Hope, this is Ben Ulick. I had another one that I've been thinking on a little bit is there's a House bill for nurse ratios that is being introduced. That if we're all looking at trying to implement it statewide, having a nurse ratio in ER and trying to have SANE exams in every ER, that'll have a huge impact with our nurse ratios in the ER. So it'll also have an impact with what's available for SANE in every ER when we dedicate a nurse to one patient or one victim for SANE. It'll have a direct impact on our nurse ratios that we're able to have in an ER as well.
Thanks for the heads up on that. That was not one I've been tracking. Do you happen to know the number off the top of your head or who's sponsoring or requesting that?
It looks like it's Senate Bill 372,
I'm not
sure.
Yeah, I don't remember the number offhand. Heather just brought it up like Wednesday or Thursday, so I don't remember the number offhand.
Okay, we'll look for that. I appreciate the heads up on that one so that we have that context.
And just to clarify, a negative impact. Negative impact.
It would have a negative impact.
Is that what?
Yeah, Ben, Kayla's asking for clarification. Your point is that depending on the results of that bill proposal and language, and if we were to seek having SANE services in every hospital, that would have a negative impact on those nurse ratios. That's what you're saying, nurse to patient ratio.
Correct, because as it's wrote right now, it says like a 1-to-4 ratio for non-critical patients in ER. So if like a critical access had 2 nurses in the ER with 6 patients, and then a victim came in and 1 nurse had to be dedicated to that victim, then all of a sudden that critical access would be over the nurse patient ratio and would be outside the bill and would be held accountable for that bill nurse ratio.
That does look like it's SB 372, given what was just said.
Yeah, thanks for that information, Ben.
That's even if we go on like RN telemedicine, you're still going to have a 1-to-1 ratio, which pulls a nurse away from all of that, because you have the telemedicine nurse that is the forensic nurse, but you're going to have a dedicated nurse for the chain of custody. So Ben's right. That's going to completely alter the way that we approach things in every area that we're seeing these patients.
Correct, and it puts smaller hospitals at a very particular spot and just liable of, do they take care of the victims and put themselves over the nurse patient ratio, and then the state could come back and say they're not providing the care and the ratio that is put forth in the bill.
Another consideration is those facilities that get put on a defer or a patient. So you're already at max capacity. These patients would potentially still be getting transferred to different facilities because they would alter that enough that the facility could refuse to see that patient because of the acuity.
Okay, other discussion with the committee? Yeah. Whitney just asked if we'll have time to reflect on what we've heard today. And so I'm going to nominate her to start on our round robin reflections on anything you heard today or thoughts you're having right now as we move forward toward our March 21 meeting. So Whitney?
I know there are some people who have their cameras off who just rolled their eyes at us requesting for the round table because some people don't love it, but I like hearing from everybody. I think I always learn something from Lacey, and this was my first time hearing Jamie talk, but always interesting to hear what happens to the evidence that we work so hard to, or the samples that we work so hard to collect, and want to make sure that we're collecting the best that we can and the right ones. And so it's always interesting to hear from the crime lab folks. I think just the payment discussion is probably one of the biggest undertakings our committee has taken, even though we're a new committee. It does bring a little anxiety and stress to these meetings differently than it has been learning about everybody's job on the committee. And so just recognizing and thanking everyone for those ground rules that we said of, expecting the best of people and respecting what we have to say. And I just really appreciate that. So thank you.
Thanks, Whitney. Celine?
Yeah, I guess what's kind of building on what you just said here, as a prosecutor, we kind of get to deal with so many different areas of this. I've worked with Jamie and the crime lab and all that before, but the FRET part of this and kind of diving into the different states and how this all works and the implications of it has been a newer piece for me. And so that's just been something that I'm now sitting here thinking on a little bit more. And how do we get the answer to this question? What's the best way, and how do we get it past our legislature in this rulemaking authority? It's kind of where I'm at right now.
I'll go on to the virtual side here. Ben, since we've got you at the moment, let's make sure we hear any reflections you have right now.
Yep, thank you. And sorry for losing coverage a couple times in there, and try to catch most of it. I think I only missed maybe 10 minutes total of the conversation, but it's always interesting for my view, looking at the administrative side as president of the hospital, as well as the clinical aspects of SARN as a CNO. So I'm trying to balance both sides of the dual role that I sit in, and understanding and how to implement it, not only at my hospital, but other presidents and CNOs across the state, of all of this information and how to implement it and how to look at it from other hospitals as well. So it's very interesting from the administrative side of payments, looking at all the aspects, the EMTALA violations possible, those aspects of it, as well as the clinical aspects. So it's been very informative, and I appreciate all the information that I've been getting. It's just going through my head trying to figure it all out right now.
Yeah, that's great. And Ben, we'll be looking to tap into that, network you have for those conversations and discussions you're having as we talk more about program structure and sustainability. So I appreciate you bringing that to the table.
Thank you.
Safe travels. Let's see, Cody?
Thanks, Hope. I don't really have too much input. I was soaking a lot of it up today. I learned a lot. There was a lot of I don't know, the language is so much different. I think I've told you guys this before. So today was kind of heavy with just trying to keep up. And I think about how I can help in this whole process. And I just really want to be able to get trained. And I think that that is where I feel the most passionate about, providing, what, or I guess like what I could bring to the table. And so I'm hoping to go in April. And like I said, I filled out the application and I'm planning on, and regardless, like with the finance part, like I just want to be able to just get trained. Like, if it doesn't work out for Bozeman, my organization would pay for me to do something like that. So that's kind of my goal before the end of my commitment with this, is to be able to provide that. It sounds like Mary Pat Hansen is a resource that I need to go investigate here in Missoula. She's right here where I'm at locally, and sounds like she has tons of experience. We're doing the same job. I mean, we have the same title, but what she's doing is so impressive, and I'd love to go and just even pick her brain on some things. So that might be something I'm going to look into here too. But thank you guys all for your time and for continuing to do what you do.
Thanks, Cody. I can definitely help you get connected to Mary Pat.
Thank you.
Yeah. Detective Gadarian.
Yeah, I thought both the presentations today were good, and I work with the crime lab a lot, so it's funny because you learn new things every time you talk to anybody. One thing that I took away was also kind of a little bit of excitement of like the cost of the SANE kits are obviously something that definitely needs to be addressed, and I didn't realize that they were getting split out to so many different agencies and so many different people paying for them. So I think that that's like should be one of our top priorities, is to simplify that process. It also made me create a whole list of questions to bring to my command staff as far as budgeting for SANE kits in our agency. So I'm kind of excited to approach that subject and just get an idea of like the cost for an agency of our size. But other than that, I thought it was a really interesting day today.
Good, thanks. Captain Honeycutt.
So did our. Thanks, Hope. Kind of like Detective Gadarian, it's not something we know we pay for the kids, but it's an administrative function that happens with the chief and a budget. It's nothing that's ever came up that says, hey, we're running out of budget money, please don't do any more sex kits. That's not a thing. We just do what we got to do and find ways to pay for it. I never really thought about from the hospital standpoint. The frustration for us has always been that we're standing there with the victim and trying to tell them, hey, our hospital is the greatest people in the world. We're willing to help you and get you out of these clothes and get you somewhere warm and safe and comfortable. And then, we get told, we don't have enough nurses, or we don't have anybody that can do this. So we get in a car and we drive 2.5 hours to the next hospital that can do it. That's kind of a miserable drive, sitting in a car with somebody, right? And we talk about availability. There's 2 law enforcement officers covering the entire city of Lewistown, which is about 6,000 people for a 12-hour shift. And if one of us has to go, we got to call somebody in. Well, that seems like putting everybody out versus maybe calling in a nurse on call for a SANE nurse or something. I do understand that we want the best quality care we can give to everybody, but why do we let people get away with substandard care? Right? If the hospital is going to do a horrible job doing that, then there should be somebody, an oversight committee, looking at that going, you have a duty to these people. They're your citizens, to take care of them in the best way possible. And I know every town has people that are caring enough who would do a great job at these exams if provided the appropriate training and opportunities. And I think it's definitely a learning growth that everybody has, from our side as law enforcement and the hospital side, and everybody working together to try and make this go round for the better of the community and all the victims.
Thanks, Captain. Jamie?
I just want to say thank you to everyone for allowing us to present about the crime lab and what we do and how kits and evidence work its way through the lab. It's just another piece of the puzzle of getting, more information out to everyone about our capabilities. So when you're collecting evidence, you know what our capabilities of a lab can and cannot do. And the one thing I really like about this committee is that, we're so kind of tunnel visioned here, like processing evidence, that we don't see the bigger picture of, the different areas. And so it was really enlightening to me about the financial aspect. And so it's just adding more and more layers of information that just kind of helps keep it well-rounded for me.
Thanks, Jamie. Emily?
Thank you, Jamie, for being a science nerd today. I really enjoyed the science nerdy things. I pretend to understand some of it and try to explain it to the patients, but every time I hear you guys give presentations, I'm like, I can explain this better now. And I feel like I'm just a little bit better of a science nerd every time you guys talk. So thank you for your presentation today. And thanks everybody being willing to look at the payment process and how do we make that better and more accessible to our patients. And I just appreciate that we've all been able to have what I think is a really respectful, meaningful conversation today.
Thanks, Emily. Heather?
I think everything has been very beneficial to me today because all of the contribution that everybody puts in at each of these meetings is amazing. But I think the biggest takeaway that I have from today is when you looked at the crime lab's breakdown of positions that are there and how much turnover and the training that they have to do, a lot of times in the communities, you hear, what is taking so long? My case was this long ago. And when you break it down to that point, and you guys are covering the entire state of Montana and all of that evidence that is coming to you guys, it almost blows a person's mind, because I know what we have to deal with on our end when it comes to short staffing and everything like that. But it just gives me another level of appreciation for how much you guys do with what you have available and everything that you're putting into it. So I just want to thank you guys very much for everything you do.
Thanks, Heather. Christina?
Yeah, there were so many thoughts. I guess, I guess the one that keeps circling back around in my head is how can we be helpful in this process to the crime lab? Because it's touching all sorts of different disciplines. Its lack of resource, for its employee staffing that's not a condition that, that is going to, make a positive impact all the way across this entire team. So that part of my thinking is how can we be helpful in resolving that? Because I look at them as being, being one of the pieces that applies to this entire situation across the state. And if they don't have the resources that they need, then we're not going to have the resources that we need, and then our people are not going to get what they need. So that was one. And the other one is yeah, and thank you, because I will never be your science nerd, so you're gonna have to look to Emily for that. But it was still super helpful. And that Cody, that Mary Pat Hansen is a great resource, and she's right there, and she's a terrific resource for you. And that Captain Honeycutt, I love the way that you said that, because I think in our worlds we really do get, when people talk about sending victims to just anywhere, I almost get physically sick, because it freaks me out so much as to things that happen when we do things like that. But you're right, we should be able to come up with a base level of competence that, I mean, that really would be the answers, that we figure out of how to come up with a base level of confidence. I don't know, competence. I don't know if it's possible, but it's certainly the most reasonable answer. That's all.
Thanks, Christina. See, Brenda? I don't think I asked you yet.
No, thanks. Yeah, Jamie, you guys did a great job. It was beautiful. I think I wrote in my notes, this is complicated about 6 times. What I appreciated was like the process, but then you really explained how, what care you take to ensure that your work is being double checked, that, what the requirements are for CODIS. I just really like that because it's the other end of the spectrum, right? We're talking about providing services to victims, but we're also, this is the part where we need to hold offenders accountable, right? And protect our communities. So it's a really vital part. So you did a really nice job. So thank you.
Eldina? Thanks, Brenda.
I don't know that I have too much to offer. I have a great appreciation for the crime lab. And, given where I fall at the end of the chain, I'm just appreciative when the crime lab can get us information and results and whatever that may be. I think for the justice system to be able to rely on science is helpful. So I have great appreciation for the crime lab. I appreciate the presentation, and I don't think I have any real thoughts about how to move it forward. So thanks.
Thank you, Eldina. Brett, you're going?
Yeah, I enjoyed both of them. It's kind of like, oops. Sorry, I dropped my headphones. They have my microphone on it. There we go. Especially on the FREP side of things, it's not something that I deal with on a daily basis, and that was kind of like drinking through a fire hose a little bit, but hopefully I'm wrapping my head around it a little. But yeah, as always, useful information that I think is going to help propel us forward in our goals here. So I appreciate your guys' time on this.
Let's see, did I miss anybody? Okay, I think I didn't have any other comments before we depart. Last thoughts, requests for March. I thank everyone for their time and attention today. We meet again March 21st from 2 to 4 p.m. We'll be hearing again from Sarah Wangerin, who is a campus instructor at the MSU College of Nursing in Kalispell. And she's also a PhD student who's been researching SARN programs around the country. So it's going to be interesting to hear her talk about the programs that she's encountered as she's done her literature review on different structures and sustainability practices that other states have tried, including telehealth. So we'll be taking that conversation in March, along with follow-up from today on payment questions and pieces of context that you all are interested in. So thanks for your time, and we'll get that draft agenda out to you as soon as we can, and it will be soon because March 21st is rolling around quick, and we'll have it out at least 2 weeks in advance. So thanks. And we will work probably in March on settling on our June dates. Someone did email me a question about, have we settled on the June dates? And we haven't. I think we've been waiting here to get a little bit firmer idea of what we'll be wanting to cover and the time we'll need to do that in. So let's check in at our March meeting about the June dates.
Will June be in person or on Teams?
The idea is that June would be in person here in Helena. So most likely Helena anyway. I guess we haven't really talked about a location, but having an in-person meeting of some kind in June. And you guys have given me some feedback on whether you'd like that to break over an overnight or just try and do it all in one day. So we'll look at that as we think about what the substance of the agenda and time we might need to talk about things will be. So, okay. Thanks, everybody. Wishing you well as spring approaches. I am super glad about the extra daylight these days. So enjoy the time change in March and those extra hours of sunshine, and talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.